All right, I'm back at the Red House with Jonathan Greene, and like I just mentioned, you're the first guest to make a second appearance, which was because I was just stoked with our first episode. Actually, I just did the 1 year Q&A episode, and somebody had asked me what my favorite episode was of the year. I couldn't pick a number one favorite, but ours was the first one I mentioned, just because I think it was a good exemplar, I think, of what I want the podcast to feel like. So anyway, thank you for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
I'm stoked you're here.
I am too. I think your beard rubbed off on me because this is the first beard I've ever tried to grow.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It looks good as shit, man.
Thank you.
I mean, it looks good, not as shit, you know what I'm saying?
I know what you mean.
So, what's new with you?
Well, so I recently went on tour with Rebecca Todd, and that was fun. And I am in therapy because I might have ADHD. Well, not because I need to be in therapy, whether or not I have ADHD, that's a whole other thing. So right now I'm trying to not rediscover who I am as an artist, but really define like the type of person I want to be, period. Because I feel like I've been carried like just by the currents of life, and I've been extremely reactive and kind of, I don't want to say a victim, but I do want to exercise more control and agency in the way I make decisions.
Interesting. That is a big project. That's like, I mean, it sounds like when you say that, what comes to my mind is a phrase that I've been interacting with lately, like self-mastery. And it sounds like you're embarking on that in some way. How do you even go about, how are you approaching starting that process?
Well, I think I tried to start it like a lot of people start it. They find like self-help or whatever, and there is a culture on the internet called grind culture. This idea of like just making things happen and like discipline and all of these things, and just being productive and, you know, self-belief and all of those things are great platitudes, and they may help someone at a certain point in their life, but none of that positivity was working for me. And it's because I seem to have a lot of unaddressed habits and things that are just like, you know, they've been there for a long time, and so they've been kind of in the way. And anxiety, I learned that I have anxiety that kind of controls or manifests in some ways that I'm figuring out how to deal with. But right now it's one step at a time. But facing yourself and sort of being honest about where you are and not letting that be a competition with what other people seem to be able to do. But that's self-mastery oftentimes has nothing to do with anyone else. And so when some disembodied head on social media says, you should just do this, bro, if you already feel kind of like bad about yourself and you feel like you tried to make several efforts and it's still not working, the answer may not be as easy as what that disembodied head is telling you.
Yeah, I remember when I was in therapy talking about basically internet mentors, people you might look up to. My issue I ran into with that sometimes was, like my therapist said to me one time, like at some point when you're listening to these people talk about these things, like does it become like masturbatory at some point? Does it become like is it really helping you do anything is the question. And for me, I've noticed sometimes that I get this feeling, this sensation in my mind of, I'm feeling like motivated, as if me listening to them is the work I need to do for the day or something.
Yeah.
Which is not really helpful.
There is a TikTok that I saw about that, where people talk about being obsessed with the how to do about something, the idea about like constantly getting ready or constantly working on the craft of something without actually putting those things into practice. And how a lot of people can tend to glorify, like the idea of, it was a writer that I was watching, is like, you don't need to buy another how to write book. You need to write.
Yeah.
You know? And so I understand that, and it's like masturbatory is a very interesting word, because one of the things that with ADD and the dopamine addiction, because it's really strong. Like, one of the things about ADD or ADHD is the idea of not being at what would be like an average person's baseline, to need dopamine in order to function. Like, it's like a lack of, or the way that your brain seems to react to dopamine is different than
Interesting.
a neurotypical person. So things like masturbating, or like watching TV, or scrolling down the like social medias, or anything that kind of gives you that dopamine hit. Learning for me is a big one. An idea that like I've become a repository of tons of needless facts just because I'm addicted to learning things, and I like what it feels like to learn something, and I would much rather learn oftentimes things that have nothing to do with my life or the task at hand than sit down and do what I'm actually supposed to do. So it just ends up being avoidant behavior, which I think that's what your therapist was getting at.
Yep. Yeah, and that's definitely some shit I've run into, and I've been experiencing what you just described with design a little bit. Like, I've been playing around with trying to get better with sort of graphic expression in some ways. But I noticed that sometimes when I have work to do, my brain and whatever system there is in there is kind of convinced that is productive for me to like sit there and mess with design stuff instead of knocking stuff off of my to-do list, you know, especially when there's a lot of things on there that I just really need to get done.
Right.
You know, and I'd rather just do something that is kind of, oh, well, it feels like work.
Right. Well, the thing that I'm having to learn with lists, because there's this whole game of doing something at the time you said that you're going to do it, and then actually being able to let that thing go so you can do something else.
Yeah.
It seems like it'd be interesting to see how I change with all of this stuff, because with music and drums or anything that I've learned, it's always been out of a hyper fixation, which is to say that I've neglected other things in my life to pick up the skills that I have at my detriment, whether those are like not paying attention to my finances or neglecting certain friendships or relationships. It's always been, oh, this is the thing that's interesting and right in front of my face, and so I'm going to hyperfixate on this, and then when I inevitably get bored of it because it's become too easy, or the type of work it takes to get good at it is the type of, it's not sexy anymore. Like, once the beginner gains, when you start learning new skills are done, then my interest goes to the next area that I can get beginner gains from.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I have to learn how to let things go so I can build like progress on multiple parts of my life at the same time. That means attacking things in like a time slot, not just having a list, but having my day organized so I only spend an hour or an hour or two on one thing, and I'm progressively, through consistency, getting better at the thing, not because I'm forsaking everything else.
Yeah. How have you been like going about these implementing these changes? Is it slow steps or is it big steps?
Oh, it's slow for
Slow
sure,
steps.
because even therapy, being it's still new and all of these things are still kind of bouncing around in my brain. One thing about being married to someone that's a little bit like me, we can have like really open conversations about what that's like, and we can try to, first of all, accountability is a weird thing, right? I wouldn't want Lori to like grab my ear or whenever like I've been down in the studio for 5 hours. Like, that's not, I don't need parenting, but what I do need is another brain to help strategize so I can set up my days for success, because there are tons of ways that I get bottlenecked. Like, you know, you're an artist, so you know what it's like to look up at the clock and realize that you haven't eaten, right? But if you haven't prepared, like when's the last time you went to the grocery store and is there anything here? And that is the roadmap to making bad eating decisions, because whenever you have to order something, the limits, there's not that much of a choice. So you'll go for a burger or something that you may not should have. And yeah, eating correlates with your mood and how you sleep and like all of this stuff. And so when you're not properly, when you haven't had enough nutrition, when you haven't been hydrated, then all of those things force your brain to seek relief in other ways, whether or not it's those types of masturbatory behaviors, just to kind of make yourself feel better because you haven't been taking care of yourself. And so we talk about that a lot, and just how we can get better at preparation so that all of the right decisions have already been made by our past selves, instead of constantly dealing with just what's in front of your face.
Yeah, that makes good sense. So, have you noticed there's a bit of a movement, it seems, that in choosing health? you
Yeah.
know? I don't know where this came from.
I do, but that's another conversation.
I'm curious.
I think it has to do with a lot, like with the Great Resignation. I think because we're kind of where we are with late stage capitalism, and we live in a society that, like it or not, is maladaptive to human health and well-being. You have a movement of people that are prioritizing their lives over certain types of like outside expectations.
All right. So then that gives me this question.
Okay.
This is a very personal question, I guess. Music ambition and health. Sometimes these things don't go together, as I've noticed for myself.
Okay.
I don't know if you've noticed this. If you have you noticed this? Has this been an obstacle that you've had to sort of negotiate through?
I've determined that as much as I can right now, I want to be in this for the long game. And things like progress, or the things that we want as artists with the styles of music that we both play, don't tend to have age restrictions, which means that I could start right now and it's still not outlandish. If I hadn't been playing music for 20 some odd years, if I started right now, it's still a believable goal, right? It's just that I have to be alive for long enough.
Yeah. And that reveals the importance of your life going beyond the age of 27,
Yeah.
I mean, that reminds me of a guy I knew years ago who said to me one time when we were at a party and I was smoking a cigarette. He was like, "Man, if I could write songs and sing, the last thing you'd ever see me doing was smoking a cigarette." He said, "Same as if I was a saxophone player. Last thing I would ever do is shorten my life." And I guess it's kind of the same spirit.
Yeah. And yet we do things, we say those, and those things like feel good to say, but actually living a life like that is harder. That's, again, one of the reasons I'm in therapy. I want to understand how better to become my idealized self.
Yeah.
To align my wants for, first of all, to figure out if I want what I say I want.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a really good one. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's another part of, I think, that's a part of the same dilemma that I just threw on the table. It's like, I've been having to, like, with the music question, it's like, I a while back, I said, I'm not interested in playing shows that go to like 2 or 3 in the morning. I'm not interested in shows that make me hate myself or whatever. So like environments that I don't feel like really support what I'm trying to do as an artist. So like that was a decision, like sacrifice certain environments for others. But then there's this big thing that's like, that I've been fighting with lately. I was just talking to a friend of mine about this today. It's over coffee. I live a fairly quiet, modest life that's pretty calm. And I wake up in the mornings kind of like wondering, like, man, I wake up comparing myself to more successful songwriters and musicians, and thinking, they're achieving these things and I'm not. And of course, that's a flaw right out the gate. But then I think I reach the same problem all the time. Do I want the life I'm living that I enjoy, or do I want a totally different life that consists of totally different priorities? And I seem to be choosing the one that I have.
Right.
I'm not ever really sure if that's what I want or if.
Traveling seems to agree with me.
Yeah.
And I found that after I acclimated to it, it was easier for me to make the types of decisions that I would like to make here, like going to bed on time. Like because I am just sort of my own person. Everyone can stay up all night, and I've been in bed for hours. Like I'm just been that type of person. I'm not going to put myself in uncomfortable situations just because everyone else is doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But the group of people that Rebecca has around her have really good heads on their shoulders. And so they seem to eat right and exercise, and like they spend time before shows, like going on walks and hikes and, stuff like that. And those are the type of people that like brought that out of me, and I'd like to do more. And I know everybody's not like that. For every one of that group, there are 10 that are out partying and drinking and, and doing all that stuff. And I don't think there's a problem with that. It's just that I know how I feel when I try to connect with whatever we artists connect with when we get in that space. And that gets in the way for me.
Connecting with artists, yeah. I think in my previous versions of myself, I've thought that, of course, I've thought a lot of things, but one thing I thought was like, if a tour, if it consisted of too many fun things, or like a buddy of mine had to work on his computer while we traveled and stuff, and there was this idea, I guess, in my head that was sort of like, if your experience of a tour was split, like your attention was split, that somehow it wasn't pure, or it wasn't like whatever. But of course that wasn't true or whatever. But even with little things like that, I was so focused on just strictly the idea of performance. But my bandmates often would exercise. They were often having to work on other stuff. It was just like, I always perceived that as split attention for some reason.
Sure, but when we talk about the things that we have to do, like I started going to the gym a couple months ago, and I'm really like in the beginnings of like a fitness journey. But one thing that I've seen, there are a lot of parallels between how we learn and how our body develops whenever we start introducing it to new stimuli. And I've read books that talk about how we learn in a very similar way. This idea of learning not being like muscle memory is something that has to be exercised, and the thing that exercises it isn't like practice in the traditional sense, because like you lift a couple of weights and then you like fatigue yourself, and then you don't leave it till the next day. Like we have sets, so we do reps until we are like fatigued or close to fatigue, and then we wait to recover, and then we go back and we do it again, and 3 or 4 times, 3 to 5 times in a session. And then you move on to the next exercise, and then you rest for the next day, because your body actually has to build up those muscles again, right? And so what I've discovered, people talk about with studying too, this idea of like cramming isn't really the way, and if you do everything with stress in a singular focus without ever breaking, and you're never sort of outside of that, then you're not actually absorbing it in the way that you're not absorbing things in the most efficient way.
Oh yeah.
Right. So I would want to practice, then go for a walk, and then go to lunch or whatever, and then practice, and then do whatever other thing that I need to do, and then retouch the material again before I go to sleep. Because what you feel as someone that was in that space and then you left that space is very much akin to having sat down the first time, where you're like, it's sort of there, but it's like you have to fight past kind of having forgotten it a little bit and like chase that feeling again. And it's the chasing that feeling of the level, or just the doing of that thing over and over and over again, that makes you better at it. But if you do it the traditional way, without ever putting the instrument down, without ever giving your brain a chance to rest, you're really only doing one. If I can finally link the exercise portion of it, you're really doing one set of practice a day.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about health for a quick second. Health journeys and whatnot.
Sure.
Mine started not that long ago as well. Again, part of some movement, I guess, that's happening in our demographic. And I started with cutting out nicotine successfully. That was cool.
Congratulations.
Took some effort. Then I cut out alcohol. That was cool. Then I tried experimenting with diet for the first time ever. I've never, ever exerted discipline over diet before. And that, whatever, that's been hard to maintain because when I quit alcohol, sugar cravings went through, like it became my personality. I just craved sugar, and I still struggle with that. So what I've been doing is anticipating the time where I'm trying to approach what you've started doing. I'm trying to start learning about exercise and figuring out how to go about that. But first thing I'm trying to do is like get control of just the eating habits. So that's where I'm at right now. How have you gone into this journey, and where are you at with it?
I lost about 25 pounds when COVID hit because I started walking and we stopped eating out.
Nice.
So we went straight from like, oh yeah, we're going to have a vegetable with every meal and we're going to do lean meats most of the time, to and that was from eating out all the time, grabbing sheets on the way home from late night, like all that stuff. And I also took walks every day, to the point where I went from almost being completely sedentary to, I was walking anywhere between 10 and 16 miles a week.
Nice.
Right. And in a matter of about 8 months, I went from 272 to 245.
In 6 months?
About 8 months, maybe. Yeah,
damn,
but
man.
somewhere the next year, that's when I hit that.
Damn.
But the issue that I found is once I stopped that, once I was sort of there and I was sort of feeling happy, that happiness like led me to be complacent, and I found myself sort of going back into the habits, and very quickly, much faster than like me taking it off, I put it all back on. I realized that putting on weight in that way had a lot to do with the fact that I wasn't doing strength training. Like you can drop all that weight, but if you're like the way that your body metabolizes, the way that your body works doesn't change, like your shape doesn't change, then you're going to snap back into like that really fast. So I decided to first of all not try so hard with my diet. I'm in the middle of a relapse right now. Like just bought a crap ton of jelly beans last night. And I haven't really been eating that well the past couple of days, but for the same reasons. Like I had all the gigs last week and I just wasn't prepared. Right. So, but I know that, and that's cool. I'm going to go back to the gym tomorrow and, we go back to it. But I have lost about 10 pounds so far. And that really wasn't my goal because I really wasn't. The only thing that I was concerned with was building a gym habit. Mm-hmm. At first, it was like 4 or 5 days a week. Now it's more like 3 or 4 days a week because going to the gym a lot during the week when you have a lot of things is hard.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with being the type of person that goes 3 times a week 3 times a week and just does full body stuff.
Yeah.
And walks every day, because I'm not trying to be like a shredded, like muscle man. I'm just trying to get to the point where I feel good and my energy is much more consistent. And what I eat, I kind of eat, but I find that I don't want to undermine my gym habit by eating trash all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm more mindful about, I need to we have like fish 2 or 3 times a week, which is great. But just not, I don't know. I just find that I don't like wasting my time, and I don't want to eat like crap. and lose gains so that I'm actually putting real effort in when I go to the gym.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that completely. Some of what you're saying reminds me of that. I can't remember his name. He's like a big dude right now in health and dopaminergic systems, like Feldman or Friedman or something. I don't know if you've come across this guy, but I think I heard him say something like 3 days, 3 days muscle building, 2 days cardio, 1 day rest a week. And what I liked about him, about what he said too, is one of those cardio days he suggested be on the lighter side, like something that you could accomplish with just walking or just like playing some basketball or something like that. And then 1 day of sprints. And for me personally, that's so much easier, I think, to wrap my head. I've always in my head thought, oh man, like when I imagine getting in shape, it's like I've got to jog like 2 or 3 miles every morning or something. And turns out weight training is it's a much more, like exactly what you said, a much more important part of that whole system than it is to just get out and run every day.
It is, and people don't understand that you can get gains by going. I mean, they're going to be really, really slow, like really slow, but you could get gains by going once a week. It's people misunderstand the relationship between God, I can't remember the word, but it's whenever you put your muscles into that state of overload where you've done more, like you've got them right to like where they can failure, you can't do anymore, and you keep doing that. Because a lot of times, like people go to the gym all the time and they don't get the gains that they would get because they're not working hard, right? They're not actually under any type of stress, and they're not doing like high intensity whenever they're lifting.
Right.
So it doesn't matter how many times you go to the gym if you never push, because the effort is sort of linked to the results in that way. So if you are overloading like really, really hard once a week, you will actually get gains. Again, they'll be much slower than someone that actually does the recommended 9 to 12 sets a week. But it's not for nothing.
Right. So how do you go about learning these processes?
I fixate.
You fixate?
Yeah.
Yeah, so is this a lot of Googling on your own?
Google and YouTube and all that stuff. Just listen to what everybody has to say.
Are you working with a trainer or anything?
Not yet. I just wanted to see what damage I could do on my own. But I'm actually not doing anything really strenuous right now. I'm not working with free weights or anything dangerous, right? I'm working with machines, and I'm just trying to work on my foundation. Trainer's coming. I was just going to wait until next year.
Yeah.
We'll see what I could do.
Hell yeah, man. I'm hoping that I'll be able to say next time you're on the podcast that's something I've added to my collection. I did watch the female Ghostbusters since we talked last.
All right, now my brain goes back to 2016.
I did do that, but I need to add exercise to the mix, like real bad. And the diet thing, it's driving me crazy, man. The sugar cravings are driving me kind of crazy.
I feel like I have a cheat code because I'm not alone.
Yeah.
Like being one of the things about being married, like the reason that people that are married on average live longer isn't, because magic, like it's some magical thing. It's the fact that like if you drop down with a heart attack, somebody's there to call 911, or someone has the better sense to make the better decision.
Yeah, exactly. That's my grandparents right now, man. Right. My grandfather could have died 15 years ago. My grandmother has kept him alive by like making him just basically eat chicken and a little bit of rice and stay off of chocolate cake. And he's 90 now, and that's her fault.
Right.
Her doing.
It's great. It really is. And so with sugar, I mean, yeah, in some ways she can be just as bad as I am. But at the same time, when you talk a big game and you're like, I want to do this, even if it's just to your mate, right? There's something that happens and you're like, you said that you wanted to do that. What you doing? You're not supposed to be down this aisle, Yeah.
I bet that is helpful for sure. Is she doing the whole thing?
Well, she actually started therapy before me.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are a lot of people. It's a more. You're right. There was this movement. There seems through our community about not just health, fitness, but like mental health too.
Yeah.
And people that I did not know had been been in therapy for years, like, and they just don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned, because I talk about it a lot. Like, hey, I'm starting therapy. It's like, man, I've been in therapy for 9 years. Good for you. I'm like, what? It's like you're keeping a secret, like, to like why you're so like the way you are.
Yeah.
Why in the world? And I think it's because we haven't always been in this space. You know, when going to therapy or seeing a psychiatrist meant that there was something wrong with you in a special way that is not like wrong with everyone else. Right?
Even when I was a teenager, that's
Right.
what I thought was like, oh, it's a, you know, that's for people that are whatever, not me.
Right.
And that changed drastically.
Or weak people, depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
Right. Mentally don't have the discipline to blah, blah, blah.
So okay, how long you been doing it?
Not long like this. I've had 2 therapy sessions, but I feel like, let me back up. All of this stuff kind of came to a head in September, right before I went on tour. When I went on tour, there were some decisions that I said, I've never been on tour, but it was my first tour. And I made some decisions about the way that I wanted to live my life. The first was eating. The second was exercise. The third was therapy.
Okay.
I was really about just being a different person. I think part of it, I mean, I made a joke earlier, but the beard, that's part of it. Like this whole idea of like just new, let's see what happens. Let's put ourselves outside of our comfort zones. And I had a really, really fruitful conversation with a friend of mine's sister who is mildly autistic, very much ADHD. And as I was talking to her, she told me about her life. And I just thought, man, that sounds so interesting. I always found, and I still was like, wow, like, good for you. You seem to have weaponized that. Like, I guess I'm just a normie over here. And she turns to me, she's like, you seem to have some ADHD things. Like, I would not call you, like, I know what you mean. I don't think you fall under that description. And there are some things that she said that made me extremely self-curious in a way that I had never really considered. And then I started looking on YouTube because, God, there are so many people. There aren't just people saying things into microphones. There are people that have the degrees that talk about their specialties. There are tons of psychologists and psychiatrists and licensed therapists on social media.
Yeah.
And the second video I saw, it was like he was telling me my life story.
Interesting.
Because he was talking specifically about people that get diagnosed ADD in adulthood, and what their childhood would have looked like, and like what would have fit the bill, and issues with that may present as adults that they may not consider. Specifically for me, because I don't seem to have a hyperactive component. So ADHD not only presents in adults, a small number of adults, but there are people with ADHD that don't have any hyperactivity. And a lot of those people slip through the system.
Is the H hyperactivity?
Attention and hyperactive something.
Interesting. Okay, so that was that in addition to your list of 3, like your list of 3, and then also this is added to, I guess, and funneled into your experience with therapy and.
Well, just of self-evaluation and exploration, because now I had an entire community that I might be a part of, and there may be things about how these people behave or problems that they had that I could look to and see if any of that matched. Because I've done the same thing. Like, I got curious and went through a whole, they have it for autism. There are people with autism or people that specialize in autism. Like, you might be autistic if, and they'll say all these things and they'll list all these reasons. And I didn't identify with a 1. Like, it's a night and day. Like, when you hear something so, oh my gosh, it's so revelatory, like, you just kind of know there's something. It was an emotional thing for me to hear someone so clearly talk about, like, how my childhood was and the things that I was struggling with.
Do you remember any of those in particular that were just like,
100%.
yeah,
100%. Did you daydream in class? Were you the type of student that had decent grades even though you didn't do homework? Were you the type of person that would do homework, or you would do the work in class but not do work at home? And if you did work at home, was there ever a chance that work, even though it was done, wasn't turned in? That was some. I called my mom and I told her this before, and I sent her the video, and she was like, I don't know, like, blah blah blah. And then we had a conversation a week later, kind of let it sit, and she watched that same video, and she was basically like, you might have ADHD. And then she told me that she almost had me assessed as a child, but the guidance counselor talked her out of it.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Right?
How's that feel? Is that frustrating?
It's not frustrating because I really have accepted, maybe if I were 10 years younger, right? I think there's something, as you get older, you're okay with a little bit more. Like, there's not so much missed opportunity types of thinking.
Yeah.
My life would be drastically different, you know?
Yeah.
But it doesn't take away from the relief that I may be close to an answer. But the issue isn't even because I still haven't been assessed yet, even though my therapist has an idea that I might have ADHD. But even if I'm not, I'm in therapy.
Yeah. Which is a game changer
on
its own.
Right.
Yeah. Do you, I guess as a kid or even now, do you feel like the way you see things, the way you interact, do you feel like there's something there that you don't understand? Because you just mentioned the word answer. What do you think you're trying to answer?
Well, what happens if I get a positive ADHD diagnosis? I may or may not be put on that medication. And the way that I've heard it described is basically like, it's non-habit forming. It's basically like wearing glasses. It's something that most people that wear glasses actually don't use glasses all the time. Yeah. They need them to read, drive, whatever, but they're at home kind of chilling. They're going to take their glasses off. They're going to be in whatever state that they need to be in. And so I still have to do work, and there's still other things that happen, but I'll be at a baseline. My baseline will be different. So I could start at closer to like whatever a 0 is, right? And then the work will be ahead of me, but I still have to do the work.
Yeah.
Right. So the answer isn't whether or not I have ADHD. It's if I can conquer what needs to be conquered in me so that I can take a step forward.
Yeah. And that's everything for everybody is in that right there.
Sure. But then think about how many, because you mentioned it earlier about people accomplishing more than you have, right?
Yeah.
If everyone is sort of like that, then why are there famous 15-year-olds? Like, this idea that if I could only fix this one thing, I could be X is what I'm actually trying to avoid. What I'm trying to get to is a point where I have I don't want to say complete satisfaction, even though I think that is a goal for me. This idea that I can exist in a moment without anxiety or baggage that I need to be something that I'm not, or I am carrying something I don't have to carry. I think that is that's the most reductive thing I can say to what happens when people are on stage and they feel like they can't break through. Like whether or not the thought creeps in, man, I wish I would have practiced this passage more or worked on this technique more because it seems to be failing them in a moment, right? I want the fluidity to accept everything when I perform.
Yeah.
When I sat on stage with Charlie Hunter, that was the biggest lesson he taught me. The idea that like this dude can mess up and still be a genius. Like he could visibly not get to what he had, but in the next moment, that's gone.
Yeah.
Like completely gone.
I still have yet to brush shoulders with that guy, and I'd really like to. I hear great things.
Yeah, I just don't hear the types of great things that like I experienced with him. Like
Yeah.
he is an amazing player, but he's also radiant when he plays. And that radiance is what I started chasing, or at least that's the thing that kind of woke me up to being an artist beyond the being technical or the craft of it.
Yeah. Okay. There are a few tempting treats in there that I like wanted to follow, but I'm just going to go with the one that feels the one that I want to ask. I've noticed that I wonder what you have to say about, I've noticed in my world too, geez, not just in the world of the musicianship, but the world of all music performance. It's possible to it's possible to treat rehearsal like a thing where you know what you're going to do like the back of your hand.
Mm-hmm.
And here lately I've been, instead of doing that with like words, with songs that have words, instead of doing that, I like rehearse to the point where I'm just like, I know it just enough, and I might remember it perfectly, and I might fuck it all up. But there's something to me about staying in this state of having to be really, really alert when I'm performing that I've found is my thing right now.
Right.
I don't know why it is. I don't know why I did that, but I wonder what you have to say about that as far as like total preparation versus that other thing.
Well, I don't play a lot of rehearsed music like that. I come from much more of the improv space.
Right.
But I can tell you what I felt when I over practice certain things, because I've been in that situation where like I'd have to do solos or whatever, and the same stuff keeps coming out, you know, and I know it's because, first of all, the way that I practice those things aren't the most flexible. But I don't think that there is such thing as like too much practicing of a thing. What are you doing with that time? The idea with practice is trying to get accustomed to a thing, whether or not that is exactly what you want to play or what it feels like to be on your toes. Right? The idea of like you're playing constantly right above where is comfortable is where you should be practicing in the first place. Right? So if that is what it takes to keep your brain engaged, I get it, because you don't feel connected when things feel too easy.
Right. Exactly. I also feel like the audience, like, I'm not connecting with them with what I want. It's kind of like I forget exactly how you phrased it, but something about how you're delivering to the audience. Like the nights I've noticed where really there was this unspoken connection that was there. Often I think it was partially what was partially responsible for that was my own sort of commitment to finding what I needed to find in the song. Mm-hmm. And I find that sometimes if I know the song too well, that if I've done the song too many times, or if I've just like exhausted the way that I sing it, that I'm not in that place in a way that's captivating for an audience. And it's not improv, but there's this element of it that can almost be like improv. I bet Rebecca has some of this too. There's this, you can approach singing a song in a way that's like, I'm looking for opportunities to make it deviate from what it usually is. And I think I can't do that as much if I've exhausted the song.
See, I'm the opposite. I only feel that way when I have exhausted something.
Interesting.
Like, I have to be bored with it. And when that boredom starts, then my mind is free to to play.
Yeah.
If I can barely hold on to it, I'm too distracted by the performing of the thing to go outside of that to view possibilities. So that's kind of what I've found, is that my vocabulary on the drums hasn't changed. It's the way that I play, the way that I express that, and the way that I am emotionally. I am much more kind of just tickling myself,
Yeah.
like making myself smile or laugh or just be constantly enthralled in like how everything sounds. And in that way, playing becomes, oh, isn't that interesting? Like, just more and more, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know, like, because I don't play guitar and I don't sing, I know I can't really bridge that gap. But the people that I like if you're playing guitar and singing, I sometimes think about guitar as being invisible and you delivering, like, you're acting or re-embodying your lyrics, like whatever your songs are about, like you're telling that story. And if it were me, I would want to be mentally in that place, no matter what the story is about, sort of playing the movie in my mind while I narrate it to the audience.
I wish I knew how to do that. I found that impossible. It's so weird, but the things that go on in my head, you'd be probably surprised to see what I actually see while I'm performing these songs. Because sometimes it is so opposite, and sometimes it's almost like a struggle between like the muscle memory of singing the words and and almost like what's the phrase, thoughts that you don't expect that try to impose themselves into your.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, I can't think
intrusive?
of intrusive thoughts. Yeah. So it's like this struggle between muscle memory and intrusive thoughts that are conflicting, and then it's almost like, it's like the intrusive thoughts are fighting for the primary position. It's kind of like the same way it feels when I'm trying to go to sleep at night and thoughts are just overwhelming the system of my brain, trying to do what it's trying to do. I would love to know more about the neuroscience about all of that, because it's just such a mind fuck. Like, I don't know how I can be talking like this, singing words that have meaning to them and that are memorized, and I can actually be thinking of other words while doing it when I'm performing music. I can't do it usually, but I can do it while I'm performing music.
Yeah, because you've done them. You know the phenomenon where you repeat a word and the word loses all of its meaning, right? That's sort of what's happening with your songs.
Absolutely.
So, like, in that way, like, that would frighten me, because at a certain point I wouldn't feel like I'm actually communicating information.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Habitual language in general makes me feel that way. Yeah.
So I don't know what it would take, because it really does sound like you're describing my playing and how I felt about my playing in 2016. Like, I would sit there and then play and feel empty, and I could just do everything perfectly, and just everything felt hollow, and I just felt like it was everything that I was doing, I was missing something. And I could look at other artists and look at other drummers and see clearly, or get a vibe of what they had that I didn't have. But not only could I not articulate that at the time, I didn't have a sense of how to go about getting that for myself. So I had to kind of break apart myself and what it was and get new influences. I had to just really bathe in the types of drummers that played the way that I wanted to play, and then pick up a completely different language that I've spent a while sort of assimilating. But my goal on drums, or just in life, is just to be way more present than I've seemed to be. And I don't know. I find that when I'm in that space in drums, and yes, it could be easier when you're improvising because you don't know what's coming and you have to be engaged. But I also want to do that playing groove, which is really repetitive. Like, I want to be involved in every second of the musical moment.
Yeah. And when you talk about anxiety too as a part of your life experience, that seems to be, some wise folks have mentioned that anxiety is the opposite of presence. Anxiety is all about sort of disconnection and anticipation of the future moments that are to come.
Sure. But when you internalize it, sometimes that anxiety is just what your body remembers. It has nothing to do with your mind. So you'll put yourself in situations, or you'll find yourself in environments where your body is having an anxious reaction, even though there's nothing wrong.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Is that related to the comfort you were talking about earlier? Just being comfortable, pushing yourself to take on things that make you feel uncomfortable?
Yeah, but there's another aspect to that. Some of it has to do with me reclaiming spaces that I know I'm comfortable in, or at least I know I'm safe in, and then actually remind myself that I'm safe in those spaces.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. I don't want to pry too much on every part of your psyche.
No, it's fine. It's okay.
Just you say things of fuck. I know I have, that makes me think of something. I'll ask a music question.
Okay.
Do you, somebody like you, I mean, you have this drum language, this rhythmic language that not everybody speaks, especially people who tend to live in the world and think of the lyric and the guitar string, you know. Do you care at all about lyrics and stuff like that?
I wrote before I played drums.
Really? Mm-hmm. Oh, cool. Who are some lyricists that mean something to you?
Oh my gosh. I came from church, so I think anything that wasn't like a scripture or Bible based was a revelation at first, because I just didn't understand that you could be a novelist from the guitar or a piano. Like, all of my early influences are authors and not lyricists.
Oh man, I like that. That's interesting. Did you read a lot as a kid?
I did.
You read a lot of fiction?
I read a lot of fiction, even though I read more nonfiction now.
Yeah. I never was like an avid reader. I never enjoyed it. I got horrible eyes and I read real slow and shit like that. But regardless, sometimes I have the tenacity to read nonfiction these days. Never been a big fiction person, which I think is kind of a weird thing because I write basically fiction material. But I love how you said that, because I do. I think of songwriting as a form of literature. Same way I do all lyric writing. I think of as just a
storytelling.
It's storytelling. It's complicated literature. It's noisy literature. But really, if it's the same as like the idea of a book. If it isn't solid sitting there on the page, then it's not going to be really solid for the experience of the person experiencing it. So what did you start out writing?
I started writing fan fiction. I was a kid. I liked video games, and so I just wrote video game fan fiction.
Really?
Sonic the Hedgehog, Mega Man, and Mario, like anything that I had in front of me. And then as I got into more young adult lit, like Lord of the Rings and like Chronicles of Narnia and stuff like that. But then I also liked anime that was reflected in my writing, and so I wrote basically comic books on the page. And I wrote a lot. And then I got into writing lyrics because I've always been in like the choir at my church when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So I tried to write lyrics and songs and stuff. Was never really that good, but
That's so cool. That was the first thing. Like when I was like, I don't know, 8 or 9. I had my dad's old drums. Were no, that's that. First, he got me my first set of drums, a set of TKO drums. Don't even never heard of it other than my kit. But I got a 5-piece kit, and I would like write songs in my head. I'd write words, and I knew what it sounded like in my head. But
and you would play drums to that.
I would play drums to that, and I had a little bucket I kept them in and stuff. And that was my intro to music creation. Was pretty much that. And then years later, when I inserted the guitar into that system, it all started to unfold a lot more naturally, I guess. But
do you remember how vibrant that inner world was when you were that
oh
young?
God, yeah. I mean, dude, I would go home from school and pretty much just do nothing but sit down at the drums, play, then like take a break and watch some TV, then sit down at the drums and play. And that was my whole afternoon.
That inner world, that experience of hearing all of that stuff in your head while you're playing and what that felt like is what I am chasing again on drums.
Interesting. That inner, let's think about that for a second. Yeah. What I remember was, I mean, I have the lyrics downstairs. I know the lyrics. I didn't know a thing about melody, you know? All I knew was listening to the radio and church music. But I knew the melody to this song. And I don't know what I heard. It's like, I heard this. Yeah, I could hear the song in my head. I can still hear the song in my head. It wasn't like it was an instrument form. It wasn't like I was thinking of it like, oh, that's what the guitars are doing and that's what this are doing. But it's literally this laser beam, this movement that exists.
Not only did you hear it, that's all you heard. And whatever space you were in, which was to me a similar space as I remember playing with my sibling or playing with friends outside at a younger age, especially playing pretend, and how you could remember being like things sort of being real in a different sense, like the way that imagination is described, but the idea of what it feels like to imagine something so young.
Yeah.
That is something that I don't know, like there is some definition of flow in there, and that is the closest feeling that I feel that I could say that's what it feels like to play. And when I'm in that space, the idea that like that's all there is and it's effortless and there is nothing weighing you. And again, the same way as when you were a kid, like you're not worried about dinner or mortgage payments or whatever. There is only that one musical moment.
Yeah. It's interesting too. It's like, well, again, it's just beyond your comprehension. It's beyond your language. It's beyond your vocabulary. You're aware of something, and it's like an ideal. You're aware of there's something like this ideal version of this thing, and you don't know how to make it possible, but you know that you can try. And maybe that process of trying to get to it when you're really committed to just that is something like that flow. I often, if I had to pick a word that, I mean, and this is the thing about being a songwriter as opposed to being like somebody who my craft is an instrument specifically, because I love playing instruments, but for me, it's like the song and the lyrics that are often guiding the experience. And I describe it as more like this, like a trance, I guess. And I think it's because it's not quite as timeless as musicianship in that flowy sense. It's more like, it's like there's parameters around it. There's like the song starts when I start singing and it ends when I sing that last word or whatever, and those little decorative things.
Sure.
And so I can trance out in that confined amount of space but it's not quite the same thing as like this thing that feels like a permanent, like a flow that you never know when it'll end. You know what I mean?
Sure. But the end is something that you should know, or else, everyone takes like 5-minute solos all night.
Right.
But it also, we talk about improvisation as spontaneous composition. It's not an idea of like the ramblings of a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old. Like sometimes I don't want to over romanticize flow state, because I think with imagination, the type of imagination that we're talking about, there is some level of intelligibility. Like there is some conceptual meat that can be conveyed to hopefully another person. Whether or not you choose to do that is your business. But so when people talk to me about improving and how they want to get better at it, the thing that they talk to me about is like, I hate everything that I play feels weightless, or everything that I play feels like it's not a thing. Like I'm throwing my hands around and notes are coming up. It doesn't feel like anything to me. Like I don't feel like I'm playing a lot. I don't feel like I'm saying anything. So I'm chasing, I guess, what it feels like to, I don't know, be in a good conversation and like you realize you made a good point, but all you've done is sort of connect your mouth to your brain and like watch the train leave the station and hope things make sense a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that's what it means to be an improv musician. You're aware of the parameters, and you know that once things sort of leave the station that, oh yeah, this is going to be this vibe. And so instantly you're here. But then when it's your turn to speak, everything can't be on offer. Like you can't sit down and merely play everything you know how to play. Because that's not going to make sense. And it's definitely too much information for you to connect to.
Yeah.
So you start simply, and you start with something, an idea, a theme that you yourself can interact to and respond. And if you make a mistake, that mistake cannot merely be, that can't merely be a misrepresentation of what you meant, because it exists in a different way that you had it in your brain. But because it's real, because you played it, you also have to address that as well. That's what made the great improvisers great. The fact that there are no mistakes has to do with the fact that if you think about something as a mistake while you're improvising, you're living in the past and you're not living in the present.
Yeah. Okay. The way just the way you talk about it makes it make more sense as a concept or as a reality or something. And what stood out to me was picturing like those moments when, I don't know, somebody makes a joke at the right time and everybody just laughs, or somebody won't stop making jokes and eventually somebody gets tired, like the room of conversation, the 5 people engaged in conversation roll their eyes like, please stop saying the same thing over and over, and as you're talking about it as if it's like language, that's what makes it make so much sense to me, is like it's language, it's intentional language that creates an outcome that is, maybe it is funny, maybe it's a dark comment, maybe it's very serious, like it's that sounds like that's where the artistry comes in, is like really what is your intention with this?
Because all of these things, if we talk about notes and time signatures or chords and harmony, like people can get down to that. People love talking about the craft. I like being a drummer nerd, but now it's more about what are these things? How are you recontextualizing all of this raw information into meaning? That's the trick. That's the thing that makes this art in the first place. Like me describing a groove as, oh, this is this paradiddle based thing with like some counterpuntal kick drum figure or whatever. It is, the melody is doing this, and I either want to be complimentary to it because it starts to drive the energy in a way to this chorus because you're building to this one thing. And then like you can fill or not fill into the chorus because either you don't want what the functions of fills are to guide you into different dynamics or different sections, or it can be a surprise. That surprise can be plushy, like big crashes and stuff, or it can be sharp, where there's no crash at all and just begins. And we've seen those happen in other different types of like art, like film, where you'll be in the middle of the scene, and then you're talking, and then there's a pause for maybe a thought, hard cut into like next person doing another thing, and it hopefully is thematic because of what was being said, references of what the next person is, the scene is, or what they're doing. But that cut is just like a hard cut next thing, and you've seen it a million times, right? And so once you start to understand music from a film perspective and the way those stories are told, you start seeing these connections, and you can make decisions based on a whole different medium of art.
Man, that's great. I like that a lot. One reason is I think I might think something similarly about songwriting, and that is where my interest in imagery comes from. I think is like so Iron and Wine being an example of this. Iron and Wine, I think, has a history in filmmaking, and I think that is kind of part of the explanation for how Sam Beam, is his name, writes songs in the way that he does. They're very cinematic. They're very descriptive, and I guess the summary of what I'm about to say is maybe if we look at a lot of art forms, especially performance art forms, in the same way that film tells stories or performs art, I think it could be informative to think about that. With songwriting in particular, it's like there's a common rule in filmmaking to show people the story instead of tell them the story, to not offer too much exposition and not offer too much like a character walking down the street saying, "Oh, I am so happy in this moment," or whatever. Like that isn't storytelling. Right. Storytelling is them looking in a window and smiling and like, being like embodying happiness. And I think likewise with songwriting, I think it's often a trick of embodying the story through words instead of writing in your diary, "I feel so sad," or like just like the way that we used to write emo music in like 2008 or whatever. Yep. That's really good. I really like all that shit you just said.
Recontextualization has been a huge part of how I've started teaching improv and how I've tried to think about drums, because that's how it started. I didn't just try to play to songs that weren't created yet. I would improv, and I feel like I may have talked to you about this before, because the last time I was here, we did hop on the drums for a minute. I would imagine each drum as a person. And I would imagine a conversation between two people, and I would play the rhythm of what they were saying on the respective drums. So if two people were like in a diner and like they were talking, like I would play that conversation, and then at some point a server would come up and ask them what they would want to drink, and then that would instantly become just another part of the drum set. And so that's what I did when I didn't know a thing about music or drums.
That was your starting point. That is bonkers to me.
Well, that came out of the fact that when I was writing, and this is something that I did, this is part of the childhood thing. When I was writing and I was working on not my novel, oftentimes I would actually act out the scenes in my head, and which meant that I would, like a mad child, like act it out in the living room when nobody was home, and it would just flow out of me, and then I would go downstairs to my room and then write what I just play acted by myself. And that hearing voices that you're writing down to write a book or whatever, translated, got recontextualized to the way that I think about improvisation on the drum set.
Holy shit. That is so wild. Were you aware of this?
No, I didn't know what was happening. I just thought it was fun.
When did you become aware of it?
When someone asked me how to improvise, and then I had to go back and thought about what I did.
Holy shit. That is really interesting, man. I've never heard that before.
Neither had I.
Yeah.
Maybe two people had I had like maybe talked about before, like with them. Maybe we talked about it, but by themselves, like I've never seen it in a video. I've never seen it in a drum course or anything like that. But when people talk about voices or people talk about phrases, they're always talking about it in a very kind of flowery musical like type of metaphorical sense. The idea of a phrase being an organized piece of musical information that can be repeated, not like a piece of English translated onto the instrument that can be repeated.
Right.
And those two things, like one of those things makes music make sense. The other makes art make sense.
Yeah. That makes, I like that. Yeah. I'm thinking when I started on drums, it was a lot about, I think, speed and power. And it wasn't, I don't know how old were you when you first started holding drumsticks?
So I was younger than I can remember the first time I held drumsticks, but I had no interest in them. I didn't start practicing drums until I was 16.
Gotcha. Okay.
They've always been in the house because my dad plays
Yeah.
or played. He's an organist too. He just plays keys now. But I didn't say, hey, this is what I want to do and start actually playing until I was like 16.
My dad too was a drummer at the church I grew up at, and so I got to play on his drums like every Sunday after church and stuff, and usually it was like 3 or 4 kids lined up, and he would like put the kid on the drum stool, and they would whack.
Yep.
Then I had like some toy drumsticks, and so I as a baby was always like hitting pots and pans, hitting pillowcases, hitting basketballs. Literally, one of my early memories was hitting a basketball and it bouncing back and hitting me in the face. And so that was normal. And then when I had like 3 little kid drum kits as a kid. The first one was blue and plastic, had Mickey Mouse on it, and it was paper heads. And it was just a piece of shit. And I remember thinking, this thing's a piece of shit. Like, this thing's not a real drum set. And I remember when I first got my first 3, it was all just about like fast power. That's what it was all about. Not about grace, not about storytelling, not about imagination in that same way. It was about like how fast can I wave my arms and like make noise. And then when I got my first 5-piece, I was probably about 13, 14, something like that. And then my dad showed me how to cross my arms and play that way. And then it all just started to make a lot more sense as an instrument. Even still, for the longest time, like my earliest jams at jazz clubs back in the day and stuff, or blues bars, like places where I'd find myself where improv music was happening, I could not listen to people. I would speed and power was all that would happen. And it's like, I just remember this one musician in High Point, and it was like I got called up to play drums, and I just like kept thinking like I'm just gonna like blow everyone's minds doing all these fills and just and I think he was a saxophone player, and he kind of looked back at me and was just like, please slow it down, calm it down. And I was like, I don't understand what that means. It took me forever to understand what that meant. I wonder why it was power and speed.
I don't know. My dad, when I got interested, he played with me. Like we didn't have a bass player at the church, so he actually played left-hand bass. And so I got a lot of my first experience just by jamming with my dad. And I think that was because I don't remember ever not being able to play. I think I was different. I would, as a child, would sit next to my dad, which meant sitting next to the band. And the drums were right in front of me.
Yeah.
And I saw someone play for 10 years, 3 times a week before I started playing.
Yeah.
Something about that made me understand what to do and how to do it, like what needed to be done.
Yeah.
Because again, I don't remember ever having an issue coordinating this.
Yep.
Is this was just something that on and on, I knew that's what they did. But I don't know why I saw things the way that I saw things. I think because you don't know what influences are going to mean things in your life. Like, I know that my mother reading to me and my sibling every night as a child brought me to that point. Do other mothers read to their children and they become artists? No. But something with me and the importance of storytelling, especially how much it was tied to family and family time and my foundation, where I felt safe, if we can bring that back, has been in such a part of my life that it's seeped into the way that I think about not just drums, but art in general.
Yeah, man. You tell the same story my dad tells, like that epiphany, that moment of being like, and maybe it wasn't a moment, maybe it wasn't an epiphany, but he remembers as a kid being like watching a drummer on TV or something, and he thought to himself, I know how to do that. Like, I can do that. And he understood it the same way that you just broke it down, like the simple fact of the coordination of keeping a beat. He was like, I know what that is. And some people don't. And I notice in drummers that I feel like I notice a difference between people who learn that and people who already knew it. I don't know how the fuck to explain that. But there's people that knew it and there's people who learned it. And I often notice that I notice in drummers who are either, I think it's like an intellectual approach to drumming or a mathematical, I don't know how to explain it other than saying if the whole is in two pieces, they're mathematically in the upper higher frequencies of music than in the lower frequencies of music is what I notice in some of these drummers. That might just mean less pocket oriented.
Maybe.
I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a theory I have.
I think because of the way that they value technicality, or maybe the way that they have a reactionary view of what could be perceived as the overvaluing of technicality, which I feel like is more often the case. The idea that like technique isn't everything and a lot of people are fast and have fun licks takes away from the roots, and so we respond reactionarily in the other direction. Because we value things like feel unlike those people that don't seem to. And I say that because those, that's black and white thinking. We talked about that last time I was here. I think that reaction of, because it's not like I don't know math, and a lot of my phrases have been uncovered by the way that certain note groupings work in time signatures and in subdivisions. All of that stuff is extremely technical, and I'm about to sound like a drum nerd, but it's because I try my best to use them for an effect that I want, whether or not it's tension. And I don't mean tension like in making you kind of do this, but I do kind of mean that weightless feeling of anticipation where things aren't settled, but you do expect them to be. Like, it's this constant musical question that needs to be answered, and you're just sort of hung in suspense. I know when I'm doing that. And I know that the only reason that makes sense is when we all hit the big one together and the crowd breathes a sigh of relief, and hopefully there is applause because you just felt safe after being taken on this ride, and the groove is happening. And that's when we start to hear the yeah, because everything's sort of back to one. And because that's what I know we're doing at the moment that Matt like plays that type of chord, or Court starts doing this thing, it stops becoming technical.
I was just watching some Billy Strings shit like last night, I think, and a lot of those moments, especially since he's so instrument oriented, a lot of those moments, and people love whatever, how he approaches guitar. And yeah, exactly as you described, just these moments of like, oh, we're not in the normal territory, we're not in the safe zone, we're not in the safe zone, how exhilarating. And then it just
and
like
you feel it.
yeah,
You feel it. Like, you've seen that movie too. They're jumping that canyon and the music might cut out. It happened, in E.T., like, and you feel it. You feel it right in the pit of your stomach, especially if, like, the chase has been going on for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And that resolution of, like, they made it. Like, they're going to be safe, or, like, the tires touch the other side.
Yeah.
It's like, man, it's like... I guess that to me is the easiest way to describe it, because it's impossible in musical terms. If we only had the language of how music works, I think this is why people have such a hard time with quantum physics. If we only had one language to explain this, then you have to be a musician to understand it. But if I can tell you a story
yeah,
about it,
yeah,
like scientists do with us, which still isn't, it's only an approximation. It's only a narrative so that the common man can understand it. Like, they didn't have to be in the studio with me for hours so I understood the resolution points of, like, 11-note groupings and quintuplets. That's, that's not something, that's not a journey that I can take a average person, average audience member on.
yeah,
But I can take them on the journey of whatever that space was, where there was some discontinuity, where whether or not that part sounds like an argument because it's cacophonous and dark and mean, whether or not it feels like all the instruments are sort of floating together in sort of like a directed type of, like, excitement that doesn't have any type of resolution. If I am on my own juxtaposing, like, repetitive parts as to say, fuck this song, all of those moments and all of those choices have completely different and distinct feelings to a listener. Mm-hmm. And again, they can sound anxious, they could sound defiant, they can sound aloof depending on, like, the way I approach those types of discontinuity. But then none of it makes sense without the resolution.
yeah.
So again, I could talk to you about all of that stuff, but it's best to talk from a different perspective versus the technical aspects.
Okay. So this takes us to a fun question. I don't know if anything has changed since the last time we talked.
Okay.
But a question I have to ask, since we're talking about the value of story, like, as two people who come from a background that valued a particular story in a particular hierarchical way, mm-hmm. like it's the most important story you could believe in, and then we both, like, kind of changed our relationship with it, and now that seems to be a thing. Like, that's a huge thing. Is it seems as though in society at large, it's this battle between different stories about reality. Mm-hmm. And I guess before I go off the rails into that, the question might be, like, how do you understand what is your position nowadays with the story that you or I might have been raised with, particularly you? I'm talking about your experience. Mm-hmm. The story you were raised with a sort of a perspective of the world, especially in terms of religion. Mm-hmm. Do you see value in that story in terms of the same symbolic use that music?
Of course not. That doesn't stop me from, like, valuing what it was at a certain point in history.
Yeah.
But we tend to, certain parts of our society tend to overvalue tradition and our roots, and certain parts of our society tend to overvalue progress, like the idea of just sort of dismantling everything in terms of something that could be better, or,
yeah.
And then we have our basic ideological divides that come from that. The idea of religion, if we were talking about it as a factual statement about the world and the universe, then I don't think that we have any use for it. I mean, and And most of the time when people talk to me about religion, they're coming from a place of it being literally real.
Yeah, yeah, you're right about that. You're right about that. I mean, that's the problem that we often run into with it is there isn't that beautiful grace that's in the symbolism of it, and that's what I've kind of actually fallen in love with. But that's like a private thing, I guess. That's like my private joy of trying to look at religious stuff, specifically Christian stuff, from this symbolic, this artistic interpretation instead of like a literal one. But so like that's the question, I guess. Do you see the way that we've just been kind of uncovering the value of the story being told with music? Do you see any value in that religious story being told? Or is it kind of like it's out with the literal theory as well?
That's a great question. I think that there are probably Christian artists out there doing good work. A lot of the Christian artists or the Christian music ends up, for me, a part of the Christian machine, the Christian industry, the idea that like we are going to use Christians as customers, and we have this whole sort of second economy of Christian things being Christian music, like just Christian media and
Christian
like,
movies, all that.
like in all of these like capitalistic objects that signify belonging to that particular club.
Yeah. Yeah, which I never have appreciated, and I didn't appreciate when I was a Christian either. Just it felt silly, and it was impossible not to notice. Like in high school, we used to watch a lot of Christian movies, and I just remember how laughable it was to like compare the quality of these movies to like normal movies.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of about the story aspect of what people believe. People have often, back in the day when I used to like really debate people about religion, they often used to say shit about like some people need this belief system in order to like live a quality life or whatever. And I don't believe in that need, obviously. I think people can, if it's not true, it's not true, you know? And I think there's something to be said about objective truth and brute fact. But the question is the usefulness of the story. In the same way that we were just talking about music, you know, there's music language that describes what's happening as a function. But then there's this other language that like describes the essence of what's happening. That's like story form. And I think what I've been fucking with lately is appreciating something about like the essence of the human story that religion is trying to tell. I think that's what I've been slowly finding more and more appreciation for.
So there are a couple of contexts that we can go with there, because I appreciate where you are, but we also have to talk about the prominence of the Bible as a cultural object and the reaction or the effect that it has on people that think differently than you.
Okay.
And that weighs on the other side of my calculus when it comes to whether or not we should have art, or either art filtered through that lens or art that communicates those ideas. Because you have, again, you who I can appreciate what you just said, but I can't appreciate when someone, because they don't like trans people and because they believe that marriage is the foundation of civilization, justify their hatred of trans people through religion. First of all, you have to, or gay people, right? You know, I feel like now we are sort of back to where we were last time and talking about, was it dogma? Like, I can't remember the word that you used.
Dogma was one of them. Ideology.
Ideology.
Was one of them.
The ideology is something that is always context dependent on someone's core beliefs, how they see the world. So if you ask me, if I ask you what Christian ideology is, like you're going to say something different than the person that I just described, right? And it's this idea that people can be chosen, or society is meant to be a certain way, you know?
Yeah.
That society is meant to be a certain way is a core belief that affects one person, like a way a person goes, right? The idea that things are meant to get or should get better, and that there is a better as time goes on, is a core belief that affects where someone lands, like ideologically or politically.
Yeah.
And so we find that we can talk about like cancel culture or wokeness or the alt-right or, you know, conservatism, liberals, neoliberalism, or whatever. But usually we don't talk about the types of beliefs that push people into those directions, and why they seem to use this, like why they tend to see that story of the world.
Right. Yes. I'm really glad you said it that way, because that's what I was about to mention, is that like these are stories, and that's what I feel like we have to be careful about, especially on like the left side of the spectrum, not acknowledging, is that what I notice is that people who people who call themselves liberals, people who let's specify people who don't prioritize the religious story of the world, and maybe they prefer a political story or like a different theory about how to best describe the world. The problem is they're still using. It's not a problem. What seems to be the fact of the matter is that they're still using a story to describe the world.
Sure.
And I think that a lot of people aren't aware of that, in the same way that Christians often aren't aware of it. Christians often offer the Christian story as, like you mentioned, it's just a fact of history. It's just like, this is how it all went down. Not really fully acknowledging the fact that it is a lens through which they see reality. It's not criticized in the same way. And I think people with ideologies are doing the same thing. They're not confining themselves to facts. They're confining themselves to what their story is meant to serve.
Sure, but if we are all, and gosh, now I sound like a teenager. If we are all sort of trapped by these stories, then how doesn't that undermine what you were saying about facts and objectivity earlier? Like, how have you managed the contradiction of being a person trapped with your perspective and trying to figure out what is quote unquote real?
Me? I personally, my journey, my effort has been, I find that if I choose an ideology, or if I heavily identify with one, that I am choosing to willingly only tell a partial story about reality. So my effort is to try and exist in a way where I, instead of like, kind of like with the Christian story, instead of looking at the Christian story and saying, okay, I'm going to believe that to a degree, and then looking at the anti-theist story, and say, I'm going to believe that to a degree. It's hard to believe both of those things. So what I do is say, let's try to figure out what the essence of Christianity is. The essence of Christianity is there are certain moral truths, and if you kind of live your life in this way, where you prioritize moral truths in this way, and you kind of associate it with this father figure who cares what you do, you are likely to operate in the way that like is pro your neighbor, is the idea. And the anti-theistic thing is like, if you stupidly subscribe to the assumption that like you know what God is, then you might be in danger of being a real asshole to a lot of people. I try to notice both of those essences and be able to like appreciate the truth in either one without making either of them my identity. That's my personal approach to ideology.
I can't do that because it seems like there are entirely too many contradictions to cherry pick and have what I might consider a coherent worldview.
I don't have a coherent worldview, and sucks.
Well, the thing is, I didn't say that not understanding that a coherent worldview might not be possible. Like, I realize that's on the table. But when we're talking about beliefs and we talk about how we see the world, because I know other people's answers. Some people that I really like are really good friends of mine. They just feel completely unfazed and they have no desire to feel like they need to convince anyone of anything. And sometimes they don't even have a desire to feel like they need to express what they believe or think to anyone. Right. Yeah. And that's how they navigate it. They navigate it by a completely personal internal experience without really engaging with like those other ideas in the world.
Yeah.
And that to me sounds really safe.
I agree. I mean, I can't really do that. And when it's on the table, it's just like a cupcake. Mm-hmm. I'd be like, it's right there. Mm-hmm. I'm going to pick it up. Like, we're going to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. And that tends to be the people I have relationships with, is people who want to have that. And I've had relationships with people who don't want to have those conversations. And I don't force those conversations because some people really don't love it. One of my neighbors is really great about, it's just, let's not worry about such things.
Sure.
A buddy of mine who was on the podcast said something. God damn it, I can't tell the story as good as he did, but somebody was expressing interest and concern with like existential thoughts. Mm-hmm. And about like who created the universe or something. And some old lady said, "Why is that any of your goddamn business?" And I was like, that's really good. I see the usefulness in that, but it's too tempting. I can't not have the conversation.
Not only is it too tempting, she has a point, because it's not like we're learning advanced maths so we can go try to figure the answer out.
Right.
So there's that type of opining, right? Which we have a tendency to do when we have these conversations, but we opine about things that actually might have answers to them. Mm-hmm. And certain people find that it's more interesting to sit and debate from where we are and how we see things now versus starting a co-research project to figure out what certain things are actually.
Yeah.
And I'm the type of person that will Google his way through a conversation. But I also feel like I admit when I'm wrong, when I don't find like what I thought I was going to find. So I, to answer my own question from earlier,
sure,
try as much to hold myself as accountable when it comes to information and perspectives as I hold other people, which means that if I see or read something that I feel like is credible, and if there is not the corroborating evidence for something that I feel like I hold, that either has to go away or that has to be put into the tentative box. And Jonathan isn't as sure as he used to be.
So what do you do with the notion that, like, I guess, do you think of yourself as having a belief system, or is it more like Jonathan's belief system?
I mean, so if we're talking about religion, then no. If we're talking about the way that I see the world, yeah, I mean, I lean pretty left, right? I also think that there are a lot of contradictions that people don't talk about with ours. Like, so I've dropped capitalism a couple times, and I know I try not to have conversations when it comes to politics and social stuff, because honestly, there are a lot of things I don't know. But I know there are certain contradictions that certain people and groups of people don't seem to realize, even though they call it out. Other people, for instance, our economy and our society actually can't go on forever the way it's going. Like things like the wealth gap and the economy is not equalizing in the way that free market people have said it's supposed to be. Cost of living isn't like keeping up with how much it takes to actually live, and the people that can't actually live are falling through cracks that the system isn't prepared for, which most of those people will say that it's not the system's responsibility to, but the free market actually isn't serving them. Right? We talk about people with, and this is therapy too, we talk about people in their capacity, and we have to frame circumstances in a way that the people that haven't made it haven't made it because of some fault in themselves. Like they're not all lazy. They're not all, it's not everyone's fault, because that begs the question. That begs the question of us being in a perfect system and the people that have made it to certain degrees being the example of people can make it the argument, versus like, yeah, there are some people that made it. What about the people that haven't? You see what I'm saying?
I do.
And so we have to at some point actually see and take seriously the failures of our style of capitalism, like lowercase c American capitalism, not the concept of capitalism in general. And a lot of people, when someone says that, they talk, oh, like now I'm a communist because I want something else. Like anybody that wants, hey, let's have our taxes pay for healthcare, they're a socialist now, right? Like you can have there's this spectrum that no one seems to understand.
Yeah.
And when people on the left critique capitalism, they're not all wanting to get rid of it. They're talking about the failures of it that they want to see improve, like bring back antitrust in a serious way instead of the continual destruction and because now our system disincentivizes competition.
Yeah.
And has for a long time. But competition is supposed to be the bedrock of free market capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, the way that you just did, I wish, was as simply as some people would address maybe the spectrum, because for a lot of people, they don't fixate. They don't do their research. They don't expand their vocabulary. And I hate to sound critical in saying that, but it's just the truth. I noticed that. And some people, even if they're on the left and identify with some of these things, they simplify it down to like socializing things, or in the worst case scenario, some people talk about communism and communist utopias. They at least identify that as that's the best case scenario that could be imagined. And we got to figure out how to get at least closer to that or whatever. This is real adults that do this now. And I find that embarrassing and also like troubling, because then when you have people, it's like, I feel you. When I used to identify with the left, I remember feeling that sense of like, man, like conservatives always look at me like I'm like the worst case scenario or whatever. Like they never give me the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes I understand that because so many people that I interact with who seem to identify with the left often go to this place that is beyond where I'm willing to go.
Sure.
So I find it frustrating. So maybe one thing I'd like to ask is just what you think it means to be on the left versus the right. Like, how do we define these things?
Well, I think that for me, being on the left means being critical of our systems and trying to figure out what serves us and what doesn't, and not strictly because America as an experiment is an evolving one. And I just don't understand how people can think that I'm going to say something kind of cringy and then I'm going to qualify it.
Okay.
I don't see how people think that like a couple old white men in the 1700s could write a perfect document and it be like the be all end all for us now. So when people talk about white men or old white men, what they talk about on the left, what they mean is a lack of experience dealing with cultural contexts. This idea that being or looking a certain way because of the way that heuristics that we have in our brains that is given to us through culture, you have an experience that's different than mine. And that experience shapes the way that you interact with people. It shapes how you make decisions. With a lot of people, it shapes who has gotten job offers or who your neighbors are. With the history of the United States, and like it's the like from a leftist perspective, it's infuriating to me when when I hear and have so clearly the idea of what the left calls white supremacy, no one on the right seems to take the idea seriously, because I don't know what they think when we say white supremacy.
Interesting.
You know, with history and the way things are taught, it's, for me, it is part of the fact that I had to be 37 years old before I learned that there was a town in Georgia that at the turn of the 20th century, they had a black population which they systematically forced out of so they could have a white, like an all-white county. That there have been towns that have been abused and black people have been chased out of, that now is like a lake, that they just were like, hey, and if you go to the bottom of that lake, that like former black community is still at the bottom of that lake. With a couple of years ago with the interracial government in Wilmington that got chased out by white supremacists and Jim Crow. I mean, some of these things are not that old, and people think that because people think about this as our grandma's time and our grandma's time, but it was my mom's.
Yeah.
And it was my dad's, and it was Joe Biden's, and it was Mitch McConnell's, and so they grew up casually saying words that we wouldn't dare utter now.
Yeah.
They grew up seeing people dressed up as people of other races, while people of other races were barred at having jobs in those industries. They grew up in places where people that looked like me couldn't actually like go into a restaurant and eat. They grew up in those times. The people that are the heads of our government saw all of the things that they say is over, and they're convinced and they try to convince us that not only does no one think that way anymore, but that the people that do think, because you can't shut them up, are this tiny fringe, instead of seeing the spectrum of racism from, yeah, fuck those, I'm not going to say that on your podcast, to, yeah, like I can be friends, but like you're never going to date my daughter, to, yeah, like he's cool or whatever, but like, they're not clean or whatever, to the spectrum, the whole spectrum, to they're just lazy, in not understanding that, it wasn't until like mid 1990, it's 20th century, 1990s, that black people could have credit. That black people, or at least as many black people, were approved for loans and houses and businesses. And they think that as a group of people. There's the tapes of Nixon and Reagan talking about black people. And then the war on drugs and profiling and all of that stuff. A 15-year-old kid just got shot outside of a Dollar General like 2 nights ago. Black kid, just the cop, just like that was it. Like, and that's a whole other thing. But what I'm saying is, you have a whole group of people that didn't get a chance to start at the starting line like another group of people, and routinely that is laid at the feet of that whole group of people. And all of these statistics are there, like the incarceration rates for drugs, even though the level of drug use in communities is similar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the idea of white flight where white people would systematically back in the day would actually leave areas, and thus all of the money left those areas. So now, like, property taxes and all this stuff actually isn't, like, the money isn't staying in the community, and now you have the creation of the suburbs. Yeah, like, there's all of this history there that completely gets ignored whenever the left starts to have conversations, because it gets reframed as you're teaching our children to hate America.
Yeah. All right. So I think I can engage with this. I just obviously I don't have an agenda
Sure.
to make it be like, well, let me tell you what you're wrong about. It's not my thing. I'm just going to engage with you in the conversation, acknowledging that pretty much everything you just said sounds right to me. I think, but what I noticed about this conversation when we're talking about that phrase, white supremacy, everything you just laid out, it's pretty fucked up in real history. But it's one of a few pieces in language that have changed, and that, I think, is the conservative issue. It's not, again, I don't give a shit about speaking for conservatives, and that's not how I identify myself. But
Sure.
I do, like I said, with Christianity and anti-theism, to me it just matters to accurately understand the problem. And I think the problem is that, I don't know how to explain it, but it feels for conservatives as though a lot of vocabulary has double meanings to it, or multiple meanings, or something like that. Like language itself, making sure it's still going. Language itself is shifting around a little. So I know from talking to like white people, as weird as that, as cringy as that sounds, that some of them feel as though they categorize white supremacy specifically as what the worst version of it we think of, like the fucking KKK or the fucking Third Reich or some shit like that. Like people who outwardly say, we believe this, we believe basically that we're different species and that like ours is better at this shit or whatever, which of course is bullshit. But they look at that and equally say, well, I don't relate to that. Like I don't think white and black people are different. I don't think that we fundamentally have different value or desires or anything like that. And I know that for some conservatives that it is like something we hinted at in our previous conversation. The less important ethnicity can become, I think some people see it as the better. Like their vision of unity between different ethnicities is one where skin color just isn't important between people. And
Sure.
like we don't make the assumption that if you're black and I'm white, I relate to white people more than I relate to you, or you relate to black people more than you relate to me. Like
Sure.
Dispensing with some of those assumptions and instead assuming that we exist on the level of the individual. And the same thing, like there are plenty of examples of, okay, how do we define racism now? Is racism a power that is systematically supported, or is it prejudice? We could even go into like gender stuff. We could go into like whatever. What is capitalism? What is communism?
But
all
when
this
we
shit.
talk about prejudice, again, with white supremacy, we don't talk about people, right? And so I think that's one thing that you said that is interesting, because when we talk about white supremacy and someone personalizes it and says, well, I'm not Nazi.
Right.
What we're talking about are systems of society and trends that tend to skew in a direction that is favorable to a person that looks a kind of way. And a lot of those things aren't just born in incarceration rates. It's born in mean family. It just died.
Hold that. Okay,
yeah.
cool. We'll hold that thought for just 1 second. Okay, so where were we?
I'm talking about black and white shit.
Yep.
White supremacy.
Yeah. So you were talking about you had gone into the systems, like systems that support something like, so prejudice and systems.
One of the things that the Civil Rights Act did, or actually it was signed after, it was about credit. It was equal. It was something about like a piece of legislation needed to be made in order to force credit companies to actually lend and provide credit to black people. That was in the 70s. That was in the 70s.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, that's younger than my parents by 20 some odd years. That's probably when my parents were actually trying to get credit.
Yeah.
I think we write off history and how much of an effect that has to people. Like this idea of people being the same is kind of a white supremacist argument in terms of systematic oppression. What most people mean by white supremacy, the idea that like how I would say it's ableist to not have wheelchair access in a business. This idea that the assumption that because everyone is the same, everyone has the same capacity or has the same type of, or most people have the same type of support system, and everything is just going to, like, systems are going to treat each person the same, then that should be some sort of equalizer in our society. And because of that belief, we can believe in the myth. I actually like to say the cult of personal responsibility or the cult of individualism.
Okay, yeah, you're right on track with where my mind was going.
So I think that the left oftentimes, and I feel like the right feels very similarly half the time, that we feel like we're a counterbalance to this idea that everything that happens is your fault, in a way that you are a perfect agent in control of the outcomes in your life, right? Mm-hmm. We know that's not true. And we also know that there are other systems that exist on the planet that do things that mitigate negative outcomes on their populace. Healthcare is one of them. The idea that you could get sick and not have to worry that you're going to be homeless because you're in the type of debt that you actually can't surmount.
Okay, so interesting pattern here. Okay, so what I notice is that people who seem to identify with the left seem to see the value in group effort, and also they point to individuals as going against the group effort. So they both see what they think is good and what they think is bad. And that happens likewise with conservatives. And this is where I have been able to find where I relate to them, is that they do believe in this idea of individuality. Where that ends is a good question, because like you mentioned, it can't be endless, but they do believe in the sovereignty, the autonomy, the importance of the individual, and they notice when hordes of people start to unify in a dangerous way.
Not all the time. I think that the issue, or at least there tends to be necessary evils depending on the goal. And I think that the far right, at least in the election of Trump, that the conservative movement basically put up with a lot of extremisms and a lot of like things that they that wouldn't fit them on a personally ideological basis in order to get Trump elected, and that is so they could get their justices.
I see the point as it relates to individuality versus the collective, though I think that the left did the same with like the Antifa type of crowd or whatever, or the communist sympathizing type of crowd.
The issue is that there's not the same. So the Antifa violence has either been overblown or it just hasn't had the same type of material link to violence as right-wing extremism in this country.
I disagree entirely.
Okay.
Yeah. And like prior to early on in 2016. So in 2016, I think anyway, right-leaning political violence wasn't as common prior to 2016 as it was purported to be
Okay,
based on
so
the,
now we have to define what we mean by political violence.
Sure. So before we do, can we just back up a hair? Because
Sure.
I wanted to mention, like, well, part of what I was curious about when I started to bring that up was like the relationship of individuality, because individuality is important. Now, you can just pick what you'd rather talk about.
Individuality is important. Individualism isn't.
Why not? Or where does it end, I guess?
Well, so individualism is an ideology. Individuality is how people are, like, how you sort of identify with the way that you're singular.
Okay, so what is the ideology of individualism, I guess?
So from a left-wing perspective, like, we see, okay, let's frame it how when people talk about religious rights, it's been a dog whistle for anti-LGBT legislation. Or, this idea that because something goes against my religious beliefs, a certain group of people should not be allowed to do a thing.
Sure, but I don't know if... I hear people use the term dog whistle a lot, but sometimes it actually is what it seems like, and it isn't. I don't know if dog whistle is a term. I actually don't use it ever. I think like these religious groups outright obviously don't, especially in Christianity or Islam, like religions that don't recognize LGBTQ rights. Mm-hmm. Don't give a shit about protecting them, obviously, and that isn't like a concern of theirs.
But it's the way that they talk about it.
Yeah.
So the reason that I say dog whistle isn't because I think they are not saying the quiet part out loud. It's the framing of an issue that affects a group of people framed as an infringement on individual freedom. That's specifically why I brought it up in this context.
Fair. I think that problem is the real problem, though. It is a problem between individual liberty versus how it impacts, or maybe what's the word I'm looking for? How it marginalizes somebody else or whatever. And they're not wrong for bringing that up. They might be wrong, like their conclusion might be wrong, and it might be the case that you shouldn't discriminate against people over stupid shit like that. That might be the truth, but the question of whether or not it is right that to struggle between the individual right to act or not act and the individual right to be acted for, I think that's the right struggle. And so I guess I just don't think of it as a dog whistle, because I think they're asking a real question.
It's not, well, I think the real question, what do we mean? So I think that you're talking about how a person feels about the question they asked versus the material conditions of the question. The fact that gays get married has nothing to do with you or your marriage.
Right. Agreed.
So it must be the former. The idea that you think gay marriage is sinful, therefore it should not be allowed.
Yeah, it's a weird framing, this whole thing, but in many cases where we could talk about in terms of trans issues, gay issues, any of these issues, the question that we're trying to figure out is what level of participation from mainstream society is expected. And I think, like with the gay issue, what we landed with was, if you aren't being forced to be in a gay marriage, then you should probably chill out in some areas. But the whole cake thing, it's a weird question. It's
so the cake thing is a weird question, right? And it's one that I actually am a little bored with, because
Sure.
I think a better question is, should a state official be required to marry a gay couple?
Right. That's a real problem. In which case, I would think yes.
If a gay couple is paying taxes in that state, the answer is yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, they probably. Then there's a religious problem. Fuck. It's hard, man. Like, okay, here's a question. What if you're a musician and a religious couple wants to hire you to do a thing, and the honest answer is, I don't do religious music.
Mm-hmm.
Like, should you have the right to not do that that wedding, that ceremony, you know?
No, well, like, being a contractor, first of all, is a way different thing than being like a public employee.
Yeah.
The idea of being a contractor, owning your own business in that way, means that you are working about as much as you want to work, right? Especially considering, and this is what courts do. Like, people don't understand. Courts see arguments and view contexts, and what we tend to do in these types of conversations is to oversimplify everything.
Right.
A court would distinguish the nature of a musician's job as different than a brick and mortar place with public access.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you're right about that, but let's. I'm trying. I guess, can we get the conversation to a place where we think of something like where the tables
I know
are
what you're
turned?
saying.
You know what I mean?
Are you saying that? What if you want to flip it and reframe it as persecution against Christians?
Right. So part of the reason for that is we're talking about a minority group. And so the principle is different because we're talking about the protection of a minority, which is special, it requires some effort. But if we're talking about the principle and we flip it to the majority, like say a very common religion, and somebody refusing service to a member of that common religion, does the principle still stand?
Well, again, the principle is sort of vague because, again, with like a court, they would ask questions. They would ask, well, would it be reasonable would it be just as easy for them to find someone else? Now I'm going back to the cake.
Okay.
Argument, because that was something that was said in court. Like, how available are places that actually allow gay couples, right? It's the same thing, like, because what we're also talking about affirmative action and all of these things where a state comes in and says to people, you are mandated to do a thing for a certain group of people,
Right.
And it's because, like, it was much harder for Black people to find a place to go to the movies, to shop, to eat at a diner, and all. Like, those things were not readily available in the way that we could just, we're just going to go to that diner over there because we know they serve Black people. That diner over there wasn't everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. And so musicians are everywhere. I could see that, find a country band. They'll play your church, but at the same time, with the arguments about the cake, and I know what you're saying, right? I'm really trying to engage with it, but it's just that's not the same, because one of the things about the cake, even though it was a commercial product, one of the first arguments was about art. We are literally artists, not in a way that we have reproducible models of cakes that we sort of just sell to people and say, this is our stock, hit me with your best shot, that's not, I don't do that anymore. Like, I don't play in wedding bands. But so no one can say, hey, you are legally obligated to learn this music and play at this organization.
Yeah.
There are too many of us, to find someone else that actually does it.
Yeah. Well, so it sounds like it's interesting because we're both still
it's because you can't deny that one side is a minority and we're trying to argue for the majority.
Yeah. Not that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thinking of it like our relationship with either individuality or systems is showing through in our understanding of these things. And so my interest is pretty much all about the individual perspective about it. And it sounds like you're talking still about the systematic impulse and impact of these things.
Okay, then let me give you some exceptions. If I usually don't play churches. I will occasionally. And whether or not I will has to do with who's asking me. Like specifically, if I know a person personally, I did it this year. I was in San Francisco. I played at a church. And it was because I know all people involved and it was a cool experience. I don't believe in any of it, but I didn't go for that.
Yeah.
Right? I didn't walk up into that space, or I didn't say, no, because I'm an atheist and blah, 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 blah. And by the way, do you know how bad Christians are for this country? And like, I didn't go on a soapbox, right? Yeah. It's not that I've never understood the spirit of what you're saying, this idea of individualism. I think that the fear from a conservative perspective is that group thinking destroys the idea that I am a person with their own thoughts and inner lives and perspectives and ambitions and blah, 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 blah. That's not a consideration, because oftentimes on the left, oftentimes in human experience, I find that people tend to get trapped in their own way of thinking, and they think that their own thoughts and inner lives and perspectives seem undervalued by the other.
Well, what about in religion? Because that's where this journey started for me, was that I wanted to distance myself from the group identity of the religious people. And when I would interact with Catholics or with other people of other religious faiths, like, it was the group affiliation that I noticed among people that still it's a group identity. And that was like, so I guess, was that what you were just hinting at, was like understanding it from that perspective, the need to maintain individuality separate from the group?
No, it's just this idea of not denying the human experience to the point where you see somebody as a white man or a black, because I think that's, again, what conservatives are afraid of. This idea that, like, the way that liberals or leftists talk, they're always abstracting human beings into groups. And so I am a black man talking to or living under white supremacy, and you're a white person or a white presenting person benefiting under white supremacy. And that is sort of this sort of black and white perspective that, well, Jonathan, like, if that's the case, how could you, like, sit here in a like having a friendly conversation with a person that doesn't look like you, and like, no one on my side thinks that black people and, like, white presenting Americans or white people can't sit down and have conversations or be friends or marry each other. It's about fixing leaks and challenging things that we don't think have been addressed satisfactorily. It's not like throwing out, everything and saying, no, you don't understand me, whitey, or you guys, you're racist because you're not up on the latest woke lingo or whatever.
Yeah.
It's why haven't we solved the idea that the way that we fund public schools completely disproportionately tends to hurt a group of people that tends to look a certain way? When did that start? Why did that start? And why haven't we done anything about it? What are the types of arguments and concerns that are raised whenever that problem is being talked about or addressed?
Well, it seems to me that when we do that, in ways that we definitely could think of examples of, when we remove the individual component from it, we might be led to conclusions about patterns that we see or something like that. And sometimes it might be that those larger sociological patterns can tell us a truth that we need to know and that we need to deal with. But it can also be the case that some of these patterns can also be different than sociological in terms of sociopolitical or
Sure.
something. So I don't know. Like, for example, there's a lot of contention around the idea of whether or not the way that women exist in this country, like whether the I don't know how to say this exactly, but the life that women have, is it based in this feeling men have that is like anti-women, this misogyny that they have, this sort of sexism that they have, this patriarchy that exists, or is it more complex than that? And I think when we simplify it down to like, well, women so this, and just like assume that something like gender is the primary explanation for everything that happens, or we remove individual instances from it, there's a danger in just being wrong.
So it's an interesting thing that from a perspective of individualism, when people challenge how you feel about the world, when they talk about your individual experience, like transgender and non-binary people, there's a reflective rejection of their individual experience because it doesn't fit whatever gender or sex norms that are happening. And so for a perspective, conservatism, or at least American conservatism, to be so individualistic, it tends to reject the individual when it comes to certain things that don't fit within its paradigm.
This is kind of true. This is something that's been leveled against me before as well. And I think it's because I think maybe we can unpack this together. I don't know. But with that case in particular, it's a question of what's true. It's a question of human identity, which all of this shit almost, when it comes to ideology, is about human identity. And the question that then conservatives or people on the opposite side of the pro-gender theory stuff, where they find themselves is with the question, is human identity confined by objective existence?
No. The question is the way that you feel about yourself defined by biology?
That's a way to say it.
That's, I think, what you mean in this certain, like, because
no, I would say identity. I would still say identity. Well, is it by biology?
Well, it's not identity, because if we talk about the way somebody feels, like whatever manhood or womanhood is, as I understand that, my inner life doesn't reflect what I feel like that is. I have a whole life of cultural information that I have gotten from the outside, and there are people that say that they also feel this thing, like, I am a woman, this is what I look like, this is what I do, these are the types of thoughts and habits and stuff that I have, and I've met hundreds of them. Whatever that is, that does not match the way that I see myself. That doesn't match my internal experience. What am I supposed to do with that?
I would argue that internal experience, though, and even perception, is about identity. And I mean, that's the term that's used, is like, I identify as this, and that's identity.
No. So the reason that I'm discoupling it with identity is because I don't want to talk about labels. The issue isn't that when we talk about identity, then we have, are you a man or a woman, and we're talking about gender, right? I'm sort of starting a little further back from that. I'm saying, I'm using the variable language to kind of unweigh us from what the technical definitions of sex are.
Well, I can appreciate that to a degree, but I think that the real problem is summarized, I think, in the way that at least I can't summarize it better than the way that I have, which is I mean, the problem of identity is the problem of belief, in my view. Like, and that, so I cannot, I can do that with you. I can decouple it with you and engage in that conversation. But in my view, the problem that we have in the 21st century is identity, and it is what we're fighting with. I don't believe that I don't believe that people are conservative or liberal or feminist or Christian or Catholic or trans or political or anything. Those labels, as you aptly notice, they are a problem, and that's why I want to talk about them. Or that's why I usually suggest to talk about them, because like we don't have a clear understanding of what identity actually is and whether it's real or not.
Well, so we don't. So I think these are word games.
Yeah.
The idea. That's why I didn't use identity or any of those other loaded terms earlier. But if I could bring it closer to where I feel like we've talked about in this conversation, is talking about you being a Christian, or you at least identifying with certain parts of that story. Right?
Oh, you mean me?
Yes.
Oh.
Like I view that as an analog for where we are now.
Yeah, I don't know. But so how do you decouple it? I mean, for one, I don't think so. I'm not a Christian.
No. But the issue isn't, well, I mean, okay.
I think you might notice I'm curious about that. If you talk about whatever you want, but I'm curious about that because is it the value I'm putting on like story and perspective? Is that what you mean?
No. Well, it's not just story and perspective, right? It's specifically like when we talked about, and maybe I'm mistaken, but I feel like we talked about that language specifically, like Christianese and values and stuff, not just the fact that it's a story, right? It's the value of that story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and what it produces in someone's life, yeah.
Right? And so whenever we talk about, let's say, the story of gender, right? I see, because I have no idea what manhood is. I mean, I don't like, or I know that I feel like me. I know that people interact with me as if I'm a man, and a man or any label seems to be a loose association of traits that can signify certain things and help people figure out how to interface with us. That's why labels are helpful, even though that they're clumsy. And just because you have a label doesn't mean that every single thing that tends to be with that label is like actually descriptive of you. Like that's all basic stuff. The idea when it comes to trans or non-binary is that experience of not identifying with things that are prescribed, whether or not it's cultural or biological, is the same conversation I have when I try to figure out what type of Christian a person is.
Yeah.
Like, because as we know, there are millions of people that call themselves Christians, and they all look different, talk different. Some cuss, some don't. Some drink, some don't. Some believe in a literal God, some don't, which is strange to me.
Sure.
But they hold on to that label for dear life because there's something about what Jesus is and what that means to them that hits them, and is such a core part of their belief system that even though they don't believe in a literal God, they still call themselves Christians. Can I say they're not Christians?
It's a good question. Yeah, I feel you. I feel you on that. My position with that, and the position I try to hold true to across the board, is that I don't think identifying as the thing is a good idea. And people who do identify as Christian, if I'm being honest, like, they can do whatever the fuck they want, and I'm not going to fight with them about it. But what in my life, what I've learned is that avoiding such terms, especially in terms of how it makes me feel about my identity, how much it makes me feel attached to an idea about me and a perception of myself. I have found that it's best to leave those labels alone and not pursue the archetype of the Christian, or the archetype of the Republican, or the archetype of the liberal, or whatever. Like those ways of being that are just like models for how to be. Because I really believe that isn't being in yourself. That's like subscribing your personality and your identity to something that exists separate from you. So I think that is true about all ideologies, and I think it's true about this subject too.
Yeah, it's okay. I had one more thing to say because I noticed something.
Like I said, we can talk just
Yeah,
audio
I know.
as long as you want.
You called yourself a songwriter.
Yeah, and I struggle with that too.
Yeah, so I was thinking, like, is it certain labels or all labels? Because you seem to.
Even with musician, I'm having a hard time, and I've talked a bit about this because I look at musicians and think of it like you're supposed to be this way, and I can't even wear a fucking weird looking hat like so many songwriters do on stage. Like I can't wear the hat that I might want to wear without thinking about it. Like, oh God, I'm doing it. I'm feeding the archetype of the artist.
But
or whatever.
it seems like it's more about, the more I talk to you, just like you probably see patterns with like in me that you've seen from the left or whatever, that seems like your idea of labels and ideology seems to be an internal struggle with how you interface with them, more so than a statement about the world.
I think so. I think that's probably accurate. And it's for me, it's like trying to figure out how to be me and be sure that I'm being me. And I worry if I give into one of these identities that it's just going to like kind of take me over.
Sure.
I'm not going to be genuine or something. And then, yeah, with interacting with people, it is something that it freaks me out a lot because I often see when I'm interacting with someone, and these days, I don't know what has inflamed who. Like when I was in 2008, I noticed this same thing. Like when I would interact with conservatives, it didn't matter which conservative it was. It didn't matter what person it was. They all just said the same shit. Mm-hmm. And I was always like, that's culty. Like y'all all just say the same shit and you have no opinions. And that is not when I talk to you, but when I talk to like, you're just, I don't know, like a lot of people on the left, that's the experience I'm having now is people just say the same shit and there's no individuality in it at all. So, I don't think the lack of individuality is exclusive to the left. I think it's exclusive. I think it just shows itself a lot in ideologies who are really trying to find power.
It's not even just that where you find lack of individuality or whatever. It's that you think that lack of individuality is a problem. Yeah. Like that's almost like an evil, like a thing that shouldn't be the case.
I do feel that way. So right. what do you see about that?
No, I'm sort of taking the long way around to sort of understanding your position, because I think that base belief is sort of informing other beliefs and how you view. Like I can go back and play in my mind how you've talked about groups, how you've talked about individualism, and from the core belief, having individuality is good, like without interfacing with the core of an argument, or even maybe just having a belief because a group is sort of parroting itself and the same people keep saying the same thing. It's more than likely not right. So you're not even really interfacing, or at least you don't maybe not have to interface with so much the content of what they may be saying, which is sort of like a protective reflex in a way.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's probably a degree to that that's true, and it's I think in my mind it's a question of like, well, I okay, this is what it is. I haven't thought about this, but this is what it is from what I can tell.
Maybe we should put another phone up.
I think I can accurately explain how the world looks to me. The way I see it is this: your hardcore conservatives. I'm going to try my best to do a good job of this. All right. This is the way I see it, Jonathan. Mm-hmm. Your average hardcore conservative sees the world in this direction. They think this is the ideal society, and this is the society that liberals want. And this is basically akin to heaven in the Christian order of like hierarchical belief, and this is hell on earth. This is also the liberal perspective of the world, that this is the best possible society and that it is pretty much uninhibited leftism. And the same, this is conservative, this is hell on earth. The way I see the world is this way, and that the furthest end of liberalism is dangerous and hell on earth, and the furthest end of conservatism is dangerous and hell on earth. And I think our only hope is to remain somewhere more centrist, and have a negotiation between these two dominant temptations in our psyche. I don't think that one solution like conservatism or Republican is the right answer. I think that a negotiation is the right answer, and that's a hard thing to achieve. And that's where I exist, and that's why when I say, I notice all these people like talking the same way, I don't hear unique ideas. What I hear is arguments for the most extreme society imaginable. What I hear is like, if society was only liberalism, then everything would be okay. And what I hear on the other side is, if society was just only conservatives, everything would be okay. And I don't buy either of those stories.
Fair enough. You also don't seem to make the distinction between liberalism and leftism, which is interesting.
Yeah. A buddy of mine was giving me shit about that. Can you tell me what the difference is?
I think that from my perspective, liberalism and liberalism and conservatives seem to be two sides of the same hierarchical coin.
Wait, what did you say? Liberals and conservatives?
Liberals and conservatives tend to be more on the same hierarchical coin, like the two sides of the same hierarchical coin.
Okay.
And leftism tends to want to flatten out the hierarchy to be more. So the leftism tends towards more democratic. And democratic means more like direct control from like normal, like average people, not like less representative, and so where pools of power can kind of propagate in certain areas. So when you talk about the liberal, like the Democratic Party in this country, right? A libertarian and a leftist may agree that it's really just corporatism. This idea that any type of moral opining is really just kayfabe. It's like wrestlers getting into a ring, screaming at each other, screaming at ideals to each other, but it's really just about money. Right? So what leftists want to do in a is have people retain more value that they produce, instead of it being abstracted to such a proportion from that, like business owners and middle management and CEOs and like other people that are higher, like wide, that's a very rough description of like a leftist position.
Is there a equal version of that on the right? Is that libertarian maybe?
Yeah, there is a libertarian mirror where the democratic thing sort of makes way to sovereignty, like individual sovereignty.
Yeah.
Because you could easily kind of say, it's like, that sounds like communism. Communism is state control. We're not talking about state control. Like leftism, like at least the leftism that influences me isn't about control by a big brother, right? And I think that's the thing that most people, like when people are scared about communism, for instance, or leftism, they equate it to communism. They're always talking about how the pseudo-scientific efforts of Stalin's Russia led to mass starvation, right? I don't think that the government should control the means of production.
That's good. That's good.
You know, but I don't think that any modern American leftist believes that either.
Maybe not. Yeah.
And I think that is a conflation in the United States politics.
Okay, so that's pretty interesting. And as I was kind of picturing that in my own head, like I could see that. I could see the nitty gritty of that, and I could almost see the nitty gritty of libertarians and leftists kind of existing a little bit, as odd as it sounds, a little bit more in the center space, because I do think there's more overlap based on what the little bit I've heard about leftists, at least as they describe themselves. A guy I know who's a leftist, and like he's the one that was like mentioning this to me this week, is always saying shit about like, yeah, I'm also like super pro Second Amendment or whatever. I think it's important to maintain the Second Amendment so that if we have this utopian leftism society that we'd have sovereignty or whatever from the government, all this shit. So I think there's more overlap in that space, which makes me think it's actually less fringe. And I think the people, we don't have to bother with how often crimes are committed, but I think the people, like I say, less fringe compared to what I think is the worst example of the worst versions of these things, which would be like the alt-right and the Antifa crowds. I think those people have gotten so deeply ideologically possessed in that identity that they just are like, yeah, like I'm going to the place of violence. And I think that's what I'm talking about, the far, far ends of hell on earth.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
I can only talk from my position. I mean, like most people my age that are on the left, I think most of us would, identify as democratic socialists, in the realm of like Bernie Sanders, questioning how we spend our money, in what proportion and where, and have the way that we spend our money incentivize the way that we spend our money towards the health and the well-being of the American populace versus Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or whatever. A lot of us believe that billionaires shouldn't exist. Like there should just be a cap on capitalism. It's like you win. Like what is the difference of incentivizing capitalism at $2 billion versus $250 billion, right? At a certain level, a person having unprecedented capitalistic control is a problem, like a tank. Like it's not that the Second Amendment is completely unregulated, right? We do have certain types of firearms and munitions that are illegal for a reason.
Yeah.
Right. So why do we live in a society that someone could, in theory, have infinity dollars, and that person cause like havoc in our markets and have a destabilizing effect and a negative effect on the country?
What if that person didn't have a destabilizing effect on the country?
What if the person that had a tank never used it?
Yeah.
But that's not an argument for why people shouldn't have tanks.
True. But I don't know if it's an argument for it either.
No, of course it's not. I already laid out the argument. The argument is that it is too much of a risk for a person to have too much unfettered power.
Unfettered power, yes. I think the assumption though is that something like, I mean, it's like we're almost talking about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos.
Oh, we are. I am specifically talking about Elon Musk, but I'm not just talking about Elon Musk. I'm talking about like megacorp conglomerates and mergers and antitrust shit too.
Well, there's an assumption sometimes that billionaires are evil, and you haven't said that, but I've heard it said, and that's always perplexing to me. It's like sometimes I think that people just kind of resent people who have a gross amount of money. And I mean, Elon has a gross amount of money. It's crazy. But would I choose to make it illegal for somebody to have that much money? I don't know what that does. I don't know what it would do. I don't know what it means to put, like, who. That sounds like putting the government in control or in a position where they can dictate or cap how prosperous someone can be.
The reason that I said $2 billion, and I asked this question, I know where this is going because I've had this conversation before.
Yeah.
This idea that we talk about amounts of money in the billions and we still are having a conversation about limiting the freedom of a person is insane.
Sure. But it still doesn't solve it, I guess.
It depends. Solve what?
Like, there's still a principle to be figured out.
Well, the principle is the same principle when we said, hey, there's going to be a drinking age restriction, or you have to be this old to drive or this old to whatever. Like, the thing that we're doing when we do things like that are mitigating risk. We're not saying that there aren't 14-year-olds that could probably drive fine. They could.
Well, the only problem is the risk that's being described, I think, is not, like, it doesn't exist or it hasn't been realized.
You don't think that a person that has a person with $250 billion of net worth could do disproportionate damage to markets than a person that has $1 million?
It's a hypothetical.
So is the everything else that I laid out.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying is, like, do I think it's possible? It's possible, yes. But, like, what we're seeing with Elon specifically is something hilariously the opposite of that. Like, he has invented a car company that is supposed to be...
He didn't invent that car company. He bought that car company.
Okay, that's fine. He bought this car company that's supposed to be, like, participating in what we would envision probably for the future. Like, we're trying to figure out electric cars.
Do you know the story about that car company?
No, but I mean, at the point being, I've heard what people say about it and other things about him, like how he was born with money and how he whatever. But the point still is the same. He isn't causing havoc the way that, like, I don't agree with the idea that Elon's causing havoc or being a great risk to society.
How much did Eli Lilly lose in stock whenever people came in with his blue check idea when they said that insulin was free now?
I don't know.
So that's my issue. Like this, I
don't know who that is.
Eli Lilly?
Yeah.
So let me tell you a story. I don't mean this conversation to be about Elon. I think Elon is a symptom of a problem, just like Trump was a symptom of a problem. But he paid $30-40 billion for Twitter, and then fired key people in Twitter. Some people wanted to be gone, but other people that were instrumental to how that place ran. And then they had stability issues and all this other stuff. But one thing that he did was this was only a week lived, but he made it a subscription, basically a pay-to-play platform, and completely changed the meaning of the blue check mark. Now we're looking at Twitter as a place where people, I mean, it's basically where influential people go to play and talk shit. And Trump, I'm not even sure if it was on the world stage the way it was before Trump came on there, but the brand deals and brand security is important to the people that pay Twitter's bills. That's who pays for the metadata, which is why Twitter is in existence in the first place. For our participation in social media gets to compile our profiles of metadata, which contains our buying habits, age, all this stuff. and this is what advertisers need. So, so they use that data to advertise to us, and Twitter gets money. So Twitter, Elon does what he does. He releases the blue check mark, and then overnight, all of these fake companies, or these people pose as popular companies. It happened to Nintendo, and it happened to Eli Lilly, who is they produce insulin. And so the text read on Twitter, insulin is free now. And that got all this interaction and affected the markets, and their stock price plummeted from that one tweet. That's how much Twitter actually controls like the stock market. And so overnight, he comes in, whatever his intentions are, and he fires a lot of people that actually know what they're doing, and it affects the world in a material way. What I'm saying when I said billionaires, and the reason that I thought of him was this example, is that one person can make a decision that just by communicating, millions of dollars are just being played with, which is like a real human cost. Like these are affecting markets. Should a singular person, be able to do that?
So another thing he and another singular person did this week, you probably saw, Matt Taibbi. Did you see this?
Mm-mm.
Matt Taibbi started producing a bunch of information about how Twitter revealed that Twitter participated in hiding news stories spread by conservative news platforms. Twitter and the CEO, whatever his name, Jack Dorsey or whoever, is that his name? The old CEO and higher ups in Twitter actively chose to work with the Biden team to selectively disqualify certain conservative stories from circulation.
Sure.
So when we're talking about the impact that Twitter has in the global economy, we might as well also mention that Twitter and the community of leftists or liberals or whatever, the community of exclusively left-leaning people, the effect that they have on actual political outcomes too. If we're worried about democracy, if we're worried about truth, then we have to be worried about that to be consistent, and not assume that if you're on the left that you're associated with the right option, the correct option.
I'm only talking about how one person can affect change in ways that are presentable. I'm not talking. So my issue is that I'm not trying to defend Twitter. Yeah. Right. If we can talk about. We could talk about that. We could talk about how Donald Trump weaponized the IRS and against political opponents.
Well, what I notice is that we're both saying something true. You're pointing out the danger that an individual
when people
can
have
do.
when they're too powerful.
Yeah, and I hope you would also acknowledge the danger that people have when they're too much of a collective and have too much power. That's also a threat.
So. You said Biden and a collection of leftists. I have no idea what that means.
Well, so what I mean is that from what Matt Taibbi said, Twitter actually worked with the Biden team, like the Biden team, to assess the damage that certain tweets could do, and then had those tweets and also had those stories, which included I don't give a shit about the story. I don't even know about the story, but the Hunter Biden laptop thing, they made that where it couldn't be circulated on Twitter so that it would not damage the Biden candidacy. Now, that's not good. Now, when I say leftist, what I'm talking about is there are people There are tons of people throughout the greater society who are on the right side of the spectrum who have been banned from Twitter for speech that is not hateful or threatening or damaging or whatever. Conservatives, indeed, have been unfairly targeted by social media platforms, and they've run rampant with socially oriented belief systems that I think, make sense given what we've talked about. Like, we're talking about if the left side of the spectrum is more social oriented, it makes sense to me that it's more of a hive
So
mind.
my issue, and forgive me, because you may not have something, and I would love to. I need examples.
Okay.
Right. To say that this thing has happened, like I try, and I hope maybe I did fail at some point of this conversation. But when I say something's happened, I try to, like, you just gave me the Hunter Biden example, right? And if that happened, like, that's fucked up, right? I would, again, Biden is like on the right side of a lib, right? I don't, as I said, as I painfully tried to make a distinction between liberals and leftists, I'm not on that team.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, you did.
So I disagree with that too, and a lot of the things that he stands for, and especially some things that I wish that he were a lot more hawkish on. Like, the Democratic Party is never hawkish in the ways that I want them to be hawkish. Right. They always back down when it comes to it, to the more like, oh, yeah, we're going to throw all this on the table. I know you guys aren't going to accept this anyway, because this is what we know we can get. Yeah. Right. And so when you say conservative voices have not been hate speech or whatever, have been silenced, I want to know what that looks like.
Okay. One example I'm hesitant to give is the Jordan Peterson example. He was banned from Twitter for tweeting.
He was banned at Twitter for dead naming Ellen Page. Like, so it's now we're having a conversation. Again, we're sort of back in the trans space of, like, what words mean. This idea that, like, if to a group of people, the identity of, like, male and female and what that means to them is this thing, in that context, calling that person by a name they no longer go by, or calling them a gender that they no longer identify with, is actually hate speech.
I would disagree entirely.
But that's not up for debate. Like, it's not, because I was very clear. I said to that community. I didn't say to you.
Oh, gotcha. To that community. It's
right.
Speech. Yeah.
Right. Like, it's not historically the same thing, and I'm still trying to not say the N-word, but you can't, in this climate, say that to me and then say to you that's not offensive.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, someone could say that, and it wouldn't mean they would make any sense, but maybe somebody could even say that and think it made sense. I don't relate to that. I wouldn't be able to make sense of that, but I can acknowledge and say to that community, they might consider that hate speech, but I don't agree with that.
Yeah, but that's not even what Jordan Peterson said. I actually saw the talk he gave after that happened to him.
On his podcast?
Yes. Yeah. He's smarter than that. Like,
but you know the old saying about how offense is taken rather than given, and like, if I perceive something as hate speech, if you called me something that had to do with me being white, and I was like a little bitch, then I could be like, hey, that's really hateful, and that would be weak on my part. It's different being a member of a majority versus a minority or whatever, like with trans people, but that doesn't change the principle. And, like, that's the problem that we, I guess, keep finding ourselves with, is like, principles do matter. It's not all based. It can't all be exceptions based on whether it's a minority or a majority. These principles should be universal.
That's not how human relationships work.
I think in this case, this principle should be universal.
Not only does that make sense, because, again, he's smarter than that. Like, I've seen him talk about trans issues years before this was a much more hotly debated issue than it is now. And I've seen him say different shit than that.
Yeah.
Right? I've seen him be much more like, this is one of the reasons why I don't fuck with Sam Harris. Like, I've seen the way he interacts with things change when he feels attacked.
You think there's egoism involved?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in that case, I would agree that his response to that was one of the weakest moments I think I've seen from Peterson. I mean, but still, I return to the principle. The principle is,
I can't ignore how Peterson is, though. This is a person that will go on and talk ad nauseum about the meaning of words and the different contexts in which they can be used.
Yeah.
Like, a person that is attuned usually to that level of nuance should not have reacted in the way that he did, unless it was all.
But I mean, we can agree on those terms, and even if there's ego involved, you and I can agree on that. What doesn't change for me is the principle. Still, I return to the same point, which is, I mean, what we're assessing right now, did Twitter take a personal position on that? They assessed that, like, that shit happens all the time to less powerful people or whatever. They just picked him out because it was like his turn to get picked out for like being on that side, being a powerful person that was on that side of the transition.
That's not uncommon. That's not uncommon for our legal system, for things that actually make sense.
But it's a social media thing that doesn't happen like on the other side is what I'm proposing. And actually, Elon posted something about that this week, like or last week, like started asking for examples of incitements to violence that have not been reported on the left or haven't been people haven't been removed from Twitter after inciting violence or promoting violence. And he opened that up and got tons and tons and tons of examples of that.
I feel like Kathy Griffin is like the antithesis to that statement.
You mean because of the Trump
Yes.
headless thing?
You have a person that is fairly liberal that did what I thought was clearly a joke in bad taste, but, you know, that was entirely too in bad taste, like cringe art for social media and Twitter. And that what happened. Not only that, she lost her New Year's gig that she had every year too. Mm-hmm. So people don't like it's interesting the selective memory that people have. Like, oh my God, let's talk about Chappelle.
We can talk about Chappelle.
Here's the thing: conservatives don't own Chappelle. Chappelle's not a conservative.
True.
So if you want to talk about like canceling, which he's never been canceled.
Anyway, just a quick note. A lot of the people we're talking about that are deemed conservative aren't conservative. I mean, Peterson, I don't think was a conservative before he was put in that position in relationship to all this stuff. And I think that's true with Chappelle too.
Well, it depends, right? Because if you go into what Peterson talked about when he talks about conditions, hierarchy, social structures, how he uses male and female archetypes when he talks about society and how he prescribes like the certain ills of society, I think that he is conservative. Now, he's not an American conservative, which to mean that he is not an evangelical nationalist fundamentalist.
Okay.
But I think he's a conservative in the traditional sense.
That's interesting, and maybe so. So it's interesting you bring up Chappelle too. So with all these people, a question is, what do we do here if there are people who legitimately don't relate to the assumptions that are espoused on the left as it relates to gender theory stuff? What do we do with that?
You mean just people that don't believe like the things that other people say about their experience?
That's one way to say it, but there's another way to say it, which you already know, which is like there's a theory that gender and sex are different and that gender is performative or whatever. There are people who don't agree with that and don't believe that it is accurate to say that.
So I didn't lead with that.
Yeah.
I think that what I'm saying is whether or not that's the case. Like sex and gender could be very real and biological, but do you still? Neil deGrasse Tyson said this to Ben Shapiro when they sat down and talked about it. He said that as a scientist, it behooves me to, if such a large number of people consistently report a condition, a existence in which that is the case, that would spawn an unrelenting curiosity in me to understand what that experience is, what it's like, how it's pervasive in our society, and like what we can do for these people in order to enrich their lives.
All right, so that's fine. But then, so to go back a step, what do we do with Chappelle? What do we do with people who say, I am I do not relate to this in the way that you guys are trying to tell me to, in the way that like it's going to control my speech, or the way that you put it, like, will they participate in kind of validating the way someone wants to be addressed or something like that? What if they won't?
Well, I'm usually not around those people. Like, there is some overlap with autism and ADHD too. This idea, and almost like ADHD and autism more, because that is a much murkier existence than we could even say. Like, even the most conservative person could say sex and gender is. I have to tell you the ways in which my attention works, the way that my subjective experience is not interfacing with things that require my attention as a functioning, participating member of my society. I have to sit down and say, listen, I know what you're saying to me, but for me, it feels like it's harder for me to do things that other people can just seem to do, but they do every single day. I'm telling you, I struggle with this.
Yeah.
And I know people for years and years have just been called lazy or whatever, or stupid. And that was the dyslexia. That's what they waved off dyslexia with for years and years and years before like people got wise to what dyslexia was. But there's no way for me to prove to you like that this, and not only that, there are so many theories now about, like, even though I've had this feeling my whole life and how my attention worked, people will say, well, the internet and like social media and scrolling and, you know, TikTok and like all this stuff, there are distractions everywhere. And I have to tell them, I've been like this before smartphones existed, man. Like, what are you telling me?
Yeah.
Like, you're trying to explain to me something that I live with every single day of my life. I feel like that's what people do to trans people and to non-binary people. They say, look, I can't do anything else but explain to you how I feel and what it's like to be in my own brain. What you're telling me is that's impossible. And it's impossible because this word means this and this word means that, and you can't possibly be. Which to me is far more insulting than saying, you know, than misgendering somebody, right? It's way more invalidating than using the wrong word. But oftentimes that is perceived when that person is using the wrong word. It's this complete invalidation of this type of experience, their experience of being human and desperately trying to figure out how the fuck they interface in this society. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know how else to explain that to you, nor can I like tell you what the prescription is to tone policing on social media, or expecting a otherwise incisive and thoughtful and brilliant comedian to be more considered toward a perspective instead of using stereotypes that everyone has heard a million times.
So, yeah, I'm glad you brought it back home, because I was gonna go in one way. I'm glad we're going this way. So, I think we would both acknowledge some brilliance on the part of not only Dave Chappelle. Jordan Peterson has some real talent as well.
Sure.
He's very gifted, very smart. So the question is, I mean, you're right. It isn't like Chappelle had his head cut off or like was effectively canceled despite a lot of people's best efforts.
I'll go one further. I don't think that Dave Chappelle, I never called Dave Chappelle a bigot.
Yeah.
I think that Dave Chappelle has a blind spot. And I think that his experience in the black community and with black people is something that he's used to great effect to make extremely, again, incisive and brilliant commentary through his art. But I think that a lack of proximity to the LGBT community hasn't made him as insightful in that way.
I think of it differently, because especially considering his. I mean, don't get me wrong, this isn't the end all whatever, but he talked openly in that special about his relationship with that trans comedian and what that was. That was impactful for him. So I guess I don't think of it as I don't think of this as there's a right answer that you have to understand, and if you don't understand it, you're just ignorant to the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that there is I don't think that the assumption that is being made on the side of the argument that is in favor of this type of language policing, I don't think it's the right conclusion. I don't think it's the right answer. And I think Chappelle, as a comedian, his art form is different than ours. His art form is about that special version of speech that takes you to places where you react, you react to something and you laugh and you say things that you're not supposed to say out loud. And there were a lot of people, including Netflix employees, who were trying to make him not visible to people.
Sure.
Netflix took a bold position and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep on this is going to continue to be visible. Dave Chappelle didn't give a shit. He kept doing what he was doing. And people who respected what he was doing had, expressed support for him. But I would read every day on Facebook all these people who just character assassination after character assassination, not with a calm voice of like what you're using, but making it sound like he was this radicalized conservative thing. He also, he got accused of being a Trump lover throughout the last 4 years.
Well, it's because of his SNL speech about giving him a chance.
Yeah.
I'm not debating that people they jump to conclusions and they I'm getting tired. That they overreact to things.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Chappelle, I think that, first of all, a lot of these people would say, a lot of these types of people, the ones that are pro Chappelle, and even you talk about how people tried to silence him or by reaching out to Netflix and people all those people are doing what we're supposed to be doing. When I was described what free market capitalism and voting with your dollar meant that all of these things are market forces that, yes, they have been, they are more democratized right now than they've ever been. To me, this looks like how the market should be working. Now, we have to figure out whether or not we want capitalism that close to our freedom of speech. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about whether or not moneyed interests should have any type of control with who gets a platform and who gets to talk.
See,
because those moneyed interests are always going to listen to where that money comes from.
I think that is a valid point, a valid thing to think about, but I think about it in terms more of what people are doing with their belief systems. That's where I always go to. And what I don't see happening, and maybe I'm wrong about this, I did see this happen in different areas, but what I'm not aware of currently right now is hordes of Netflix employees and conservatives throughout the country trying to get trans or female or LGBTQ or any kind of comedy taken off of Netflix.
Sure, no, they're not. They're going to school boards.
They're going to, yeah.
So,
Do you want? We can go into that if you
Like,
want.
it's the issue isn't, it doesn't seem to me the structure of how things are working. It's whether or not you tend to agree with the people, what the mob is saying. And so we can talk about collective action and whether or the types of things we're comfortable with them affecting, or we can talk about the content of which those arguments, or the content of those arguments, and whether we agree with them or not.
We can talk about either of those things. We can also talk about the motivation behind either thing. But in the Chappelle case, and this is where we started, is it accurate for me to say and to characterize the current day as an environment in which conservative voices have been treated less fairly than liberal voices or leftist or however you like? I guess I would say liberal, right? It probably makes more sense to you if I say liberal. Yeah.
Because leftist voices are not liked in those spaces. Sorry, we talk about even progressives.
What do you consider AOC?
So AOC is a small part of on the Democratic Party that is progressives are a minority of the Democratic Party.
But like her and Bernie Sanders,
they're progressives. Like specifically, like Bernie is a social democrat. I'm not sure where AOC lies. She probably lies somewhere in there. But there are maybe 5 progressives in the Democratic Party.
All right, so here's the problem. I can offer a bunch of different examples. Some of them will be good or bad. Mm-hmm. If I throw out the name Alex Jones,
sure,
you and I will agree that he shouldn't have said the shit he said. So it's like I don't want to be confused for being in favor of that. I can throw out name after name of people who, whether they're a little bit left or pretty hard right, mm-hmm, they're just not on the real left side of the spectrum.
It doesn't. So, are you trying to reach me, or because I feel like it keeps coming back to trying to get me to agree that in liberal spaces, conservatives tend to be silenced? I
guess that's a fair question. I don't think I'm necessarily trying to reach you with a certain thing. I think what I'm trying to do is figure out if we have a comparable or a harmonious understanding of the conditions that we're in. And I don't know who you think is victim to more scrutiny, but I think that the popular culture is trying to reject reasonable conservatism. They have been trying to reject reasonable conservatism for a long time. And I think that when we're talking about the problem between like the individual versus the collective, I think the reason that people like Musk and Peterson and reasonable people the attempt is to mischaracterize them as all evil people. I think part of the reason for that is to pettifog the issue and to make it seem as though reasonable conservatives they shouldn't be engaged with, because what we want in society is the popular left-leaning vision that we have.
So Fox News is one of the biggest news conglomerates in the world. They are big by like net worth, and I don't know if that ever counts. And now with the buying of CNN and the changing of the guard, and they have been extremely, extremely vocal about righting the ship to make it more balanced, while also ending like certain types of content on HBO, and like there is a push towards conservatism coming on CNN.
Like it's about time. It's going to happen.
No, I mean they've been like, they have new management. Like everything is. But when you talk about conservatism, so when people talk about conservatism or reasonable conservatism, what does that mean?
The useful side of being conservative.
Okay, cool. What does that mean?
Okay, I break it down like this. I think when we talk about collective and individuality, or there's that. there is the necessary importance of maintaining individualism as it relates to collectivism. Both of those things are useful, and we have to have both.
Okay.
There's also this problem between prosperity and survival. I think conservative ideology is very good at survival, and I think that whatever liberal or the left side of the spectrum, that ideology is really good at trying to maximize prosperity for all people. Like, I think that's part of what your belief system is all about, is like there are very few people really prospering and a lot of people not prospering at all, and that's wrong.
So when I talk about prosperity, I don't think is right. Like, let's talk about how it is a strategy for investment banks to hold on to houses so the property values of houses go up and those houses just sit vacant. And as those houses go up, there are less and less people that can actually afford to live in those houses.
That wouldn't matter if there were only 6 people in the world. I guess the reason that matters is because there are so many people without houses, right?
I mean, it matters because it's not just about those people. It's what it does to the market and how there's going to be another housing crash soon. But
and the result of that would be more people without houses. So, I mean,
it would, but that's a 2-layer cake of shit.
Yeah. I think a lot of the essence of those concerns is all about, like, I don't mean that in any kind of weak or like simplistic way. I'm just saying I think that a lot of the left side of the spectrum of thought is it points its effort, the essence of its effort is like, we need to try to make as many people's lives good as we can.
But conservatism to me seems to challenge that on every level.
Exactly.
Whether or not it's so let's talk about the first housing crash and subprime loans and like loans that banks wouldn't have gotten, right? The conservative argument is to let them do what they want because government sucks at regulating businesses. And if these people are generating whatever and they're not technically breaking the law, then everybody should be then it's fair game, right? But from a leftist position, like the bare minimum is to actually either try to educate, because it's not like you go to school and you understand how mortgages work, right? There's so many ways that a person that is actually educated through high school is unequipped to deal with the world as it is, let alone people that live in subpar neighborhoods and they don't have the best education, right?
Yeah.
So if there were any type of campaign to actually inform how mortgages work, if there were I lack political imagination when it comes to programs, but what I'm saying is no matter what solution I could sit down and try to figure out, it seems to me that a conservative at every single point would just say no.
I don't know if that's true or not. Conservatives, their agenda isn't to minimize everything that you want to do.
So let's talk about education. Let's talk about the public education system, because it seems to be I don't want to say conservative when I mean Republican here. I mean, I may have done that in my first example.
That's fine.
I don't think that they're necessarily interchangeable. This is why I'm making the distinction.
Gotcha.
But I think the Republican platform tends towards privatization, and privatization tends towards exclusivity. So if you push for more private public schools instead of public schools, and you continue to leave the schools underserved that are underserved, then it doesn't. Stupid people don't make good citizens.
Yeah, sure.
So when we talk about individualism, I don't understand how people that talk about individualism could see the ways that people could be helped and empowered to have more power, be healthier, have more buying power, and actually practice autonomy, but don't make those steps?
Well, I follow everything you just said. As far as the initial sort of push for this portion of the conversation, I don't know how to answer that exactly. Republican, Democrat, this, that, we can, it'd probably help if we could define every term individually or whatever.
Go back to Chappelle.
It don't matter to me. We can talk about this. It's just, I forget how you phrased the question, but my theory is that both of these sides of the spectrum are useful. And you had asked me about reasonable conservatism. Maybe also you could ask me about reasonable Republicans. Don't matter to me.
Right.
The point is that on either side of this spectrum, there's such a thing as useful voices that express the opposite of maybe your ideology, maybe my, even my nature, which is probably actually has a lot in common with the way you see things. But like real natural conservatives, like there's a usefulness in being cautious. There's a usefulness in being fiscally careful. There's a usefulness in being oriented towards survival. Even exclusivity, there's a usefulness for exclusivity. And like private schools, it's like private schools are an example of it where we're not as comfortable with the idea of exclusivity. But like towns are exclusive, like cities are exclusive, like borders exist. That's the reality that we live in right now, at least. Borders exist, and we're trying to figure out where those borders belong. That's usually something that conservatives or Republicans are skilled at, even if they're not good at it, even if sometimes they make bad decisions. That's one of their skills compared to liberals who often don't see the usefulness of borders at all, it seems.
It's interesting. I think you, again, confuse liberals and leftists. I think that liberals are just fine with, like, people forget that some of the harshest, like, the borders tightened over under Obama.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I don't understand what people mean when they state they conflate liberals with wanting open borders. Like,
I think that's like conflating it with the speaking points that your average soapbox liberal says they believe in, even though their politicians don't represent that value at all.
Yeah, but yes, correct.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. Like, at one point, we were talking about the LGBTQ community, and we found ourselves in the reasonable conservative aspect because you seem to believe that what they have to say regarding some of what conservatives have to say regarding that community is reasonable.
Yeah.
And do you think it's wrong that certain platforms will silence that speech?
Yeah. Especially if it means we can't have a conversation about it.
So which also means that you think that people should be equally entitled on social media platforms to have certain types of conversations.
To some degree, at least that's my starting point for sure. Unless for some reason I'm led to a different conclusion.
Social media sites aren't publicly owned.
I mean, yeah, I know that, but what? Like, what are we supposed to do with that?
Well, nothing. Like the idea that, like, so now we're talking about idealism, right?
Like you talked about maybe the economic importance of it, and I mentioned the political importance of it. Given that Twitter is perceived to be and is economically and politically important, I don't think it's a good idea to say, well, only populist voices are allowed on it.
No, but my solution isn't by saying how Twitter should run their speech policies. My solution is something that I mentioned earlier. It's my idea that I am anti large mega like monopolies. My solution is not allowing to have like Twitter to have that much control over that market by having competition.
Right.
And because I know that anti-competitive policies got Twitter to where it is.
Yeah. I mean, there have been, there have been efforts in the recent years to create alternatives to what were perceived as liberally dominated social media spaces.
Sure.
And a lot of those, accurately or not, I don't really know, but a lot of them were described as like, oh, this is alt, so this is like where all the fucking, like neo-Nazis and shit are going. And it's like, I don't know if that was true or not, but I remember one instance where I think the impression I had was that it was not true. And maybe it's Rumble. I'm not sure. Anyway, the point being, are you saying that it's a good idea for there to be a conservative social media?
I'm saying that if there weren't one thing, then the idea of someone being like, it's the same with YouTube for different reasons. Like, we all suffer in some way because because the monolith can change the algorithm for whatever reason at any moment, and all of a sudden we are not reaching our audience. This has happened long before Jordan Peterson, Dave Chappelle, I've heard the people on social media, specifically on YouTube, talk all the time about all of a sudden a certain word will get flagged and they're demonetized.
Yeah.
Even if they actually are talking against the thing that, they can't say, whatever. And they're saying this is the history of that thing and this is why it's bad. It doesn't matter because the robots they're combing YouTube, flagging for words because they don't have enough employees. Social media things don't have enough employees to flag things. These are parts of this is the culture, which means that there's tons of friendly fire, but so who the fuck cares? This is just their broad strokes, and this is the cheapest way for them to solve that issue.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So if there were more than one YouTube,
right,
there would be more than one place for people that actually try to do that thing. And if this platform could be this, then they would find their identity in solving whatever that thing isn't. That's what used to seem to be. That's why, Netflix and Hulu aren't quite the same, or HBO is different. Like, all of these places, not only did they have different types of content, and so they had different audiences. Like, someone can be, this is more kid stuff, this is more experimental, this has more network stuff. Like, everybody has their niche. Like, what happened to that?
Well, let me make sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I in a way, what you've described is some of that, because Twitter and YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, they all exist separate from each other. So they have their niches. Twitter is whatever it is. But there have been competitors to try to come up, like, to compete with YouTube. But I just think, it's...
Well, YouTube, the reason that YouTube competes the way it does is because it's owned by Google. People forget that sometimes.
Yeah. That's true. And then, now, I mean...
And Hulu is owned by Disney.
Yeah.
And those Disney, YouTube, Hulu used to have, I don't know, it still does. So the cool thing about companies, or it's cool when companies can leave properties alone sometimes. So Disney did not come when they acquired Hulu and completely change the game. They just let Hulu kind of be who they were, but they kind of packaged them in this huge thing. But they also learned that it's like, oh, we don't have to pay to advertise here. We could use this to funnel everyone towards this one little thing. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's, again, kind of making my point for me. Like like the Disney Marvel universe or Disney Star Wars, like, people like that stuff right now because they're getting exactly what they want. They're getting more and more of exactly what they want. Now there's fatigue with Marvel more and more, where I didn't see Black Panther. I didn't. It makes me a bad Black person. But as much as I love superhero movies, I think that monopolies are bad.
Yeah.
And I think that is a root cause of some of the ills that we're talking about.
Gotcha.
Even with Chappelle.
Yeah.
Even though arguably he could have because before the things with Louis C.K. actually had his own website, and he posted all of his content himself.
Yeah.
And he actually made a lot of money that way without like posting it everywhere else. Like he controlled all of this stuff. Like Taylor Swift recently she couldn't get her master, so she just re-recorded all of her stuff, made a shit ton of money, and she owns it all.
Yeah.
Radiohead did that in the early 2000s with In Rainbows after they got off of there, and then they, I mean, back in Metallica days and Napster, like there still seems to be space if you are already big enough.
Yeah.
To be inoculated towards being canceled, whether or not it's by piracy websites or being exploited by Ticketmaster, again, a la Taylor Swift, or any of these people. But as long as you're already big, and that's why I'm not worried about Jordan Peterson. That's not why I'm worried about. So I'm not worried about Dave Chappelle, because people like that are self-perpetuated machines that you actually never will cancel. Right? Yeah. It's always the fear that like a person like me could go and I could just get kicked off, and then I don't have a way to that anymore, and then I'm an island without like a voice.
Sort of. I mean, that would be scarier. Yes. So that I acknowledge as a real fear. I guess. I mean, it's just like. I mean, people simplify these people down to the fear that they have about them sometimes. And I very much disagree with that. It's not all about just being canceled, like they can't make money anymore. Sometimes it's just about the lies that people are willing to tell to like make it sound like Dave Chappelle is something worse than what he is. And I'm just not for that. I
get it. And I also get the fact that celebrities are human beings, right? Yeah. If we want to take this conversation in the same general location, but sidestep some of the weightier stuff, we can talk about Will Smith and Chris Rock.
Oh, yeah, sure. If you want to.
Right. We talk about a moment that was really divisive. On one side, he stood up for his wife in a situation where a lot of men felt vindicated in their own responsibilities toward their spouses and their ideas of manhoods, and they could praise Will Smith from being the type of person that, like, in face of like public humiliation, he actually stood up with a straight back and defended his idea of honor. That's one story.
Mm-hmm. That's a story.
Yeah. You have the other story where a person that is a celebrity that gets talked about a bunch of different ways and has been for his entire career at what should have been the highest highlight of his night by winning Best Actor, made an ass of himself by losing his temper.
Yeah.
Because violence as a response to speech should never be the answer.
Yeah.
Now, all of these civil, like, free speech absolutists, free marketplace of ideas people on my feed stood up and applauded Will Smith for smacking Chris Rock in the face. And I had to deal with the conflict that caused in my head with people that talk about speech and how speech is not enough to prompt actions, that speech is not there is no such thing as insightful speech, because if there is, then that robs the person that being spoken to of agency, thus crippling the idea of individualism in that way, of individual control. That's how I think about how conservatives think about speech. This idea that a person should be able to say whatever they want, and however a person reacts is 100% on them.
Like, you mean with violence?
Well, it depends. I think that's context dependent. given what I just said about Will Smith and and some of their responses to that. I think a lot of people said that. No, I know a lot of people said that Will Smith did what he had to do.
Yeah, I mean, I land personally on that it was a stupid idea and
Sure.
shouldn't have done that, obviously, and on the don't respond to speech with violence. Like that's where I landed. Now, how do we identify this as conservative or liberal? Like, obviously, if we're talking about stereotypes, there are religious people who think that insulting language toward their religion doesn't count in free speech terms, which I think is silly, because of course it does. And then there are people who are on the side that's like political correctness is a good idea. Like a politically or personally offensive language is not apropos or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's probably somebody on the left side of the spectrum. I don't care what they're called. That's somebody else. Meaning there seem to be two versions of sensitivity to speech that both seem to think that it's okay to curtail speech. I don't relate to either of those. I whether I'm an absolutist, I used to say I was. I don't know if I'm an absolutist now, but I definitely don't tend to identify with anything that says that speech should be responded to with violence.
My take on Will Smith was a lot like my take on Dave Chappelle and Jordan Peterson. My take was this was a rich person that could afford therapy. That makes him ahead of most of my friends in similar situations that may have actually been carted off to jail if that happened in a bar and he hit somebody in the face, and would just be left with what that means, because I have a lot of friends that don't have health care.
Yeah.
And I know they can't afford the same type of mental health like care that Will Smith can afford. Whether or not Will Smith chooses to seek that health care is on him. But when we talk about people like Jordan Peterson or Dave Chappelle and Will Smith, the types of situations that they're in are, in their cases, because it's not always, but in their cases seems to be the type of exposure that they get is in proportion to their resources or the resources that they bring in. So Jordan Peterson can afford to go to whatever fuck off to whatever country to get whatever surgery he wanted to get or whatever procedure he wanted to get, right? I'm not saying that. I don't think that any human being is meant for celebrity. I think celebrity is another weird maladaptive state for a human being to be in.
Yeah.
Right.
Gotta be. Yeah.
So I'm not excusing celebrity and as a state of being and celebrities as people as, oh, they know what they signed up for, so they're fair game. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that they have resources to take care of themselves that most average Americans don't.
That puts a lot of value, I guess, on an excess of wealth. Like, I mean, I guess most average Americans have access to resources that most people in the world don't.
Sure, but I'm only talking about the context of American culture.
Okay. So, like, globally speaking, I guess then are you saying that the more sort of like resources you have, the more ideally you should act?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question, because, you know, there's this whole God, I talked about Marvel, and I'm about to say with great power comes great responsibility.
It had to be said.
But it does go back to my idea that I don't think the billionaires should exist, at least not to the extent that they do. Like, what's the difference between $2 billion and $250 billion? The idea that, like, you know, the way that we give power in this country, whether idealized and like processed, and how the process fails, like, you know, police academy or, you know, elected officials, and how flawed like some of them can be, like the systems aren't perfect, right? But we do try to at least say that we hold them to standards that are higher than the average person, right?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I think we do that intuitive.
I mean, we
Yeah.
should at least. I think that under no circumstances a police officer should pull out his weapon and shoot someone merely because they're afraid.
Agreed. The only reason I hesitated with that answer is because our standards aren't all the same. In that area, our standards are identical. In other areas, like when we're talking about how, whatever, should cops be virtuous? Yes, they should be good people.
Well, no. So as a leftist, I want to live in a society that I would love for all people to be good. I think that all people being good is one of those like utopian, like la la fantasies. Mm-hmm. I think that we should build systems in a way that either maximizes people's goodness or severely disincentivizes the behaviors we don't want.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the same thing, because the second way that I said it actually takes zero into account of someone's virtue.
Let me offer the problem with let me insert the individual thing.
Sure.
One day, a friend of mine said to me something about like, yeah, I was at my, somebody drove down my street shooting guns, and I was like, damn, that's fucking crazy. And then they went on to explain that the reason that this occurred is because we don't have the systems in place to account for such things, or some shit like that. How can we just assume all the time that systems are to be the response to individual issues like that? Like when you're talking about the system of cops, I get it, but systems can't account for disincentivizing all behaviors on an individual level.
Well, it depends, right? Because if we talk about when I talk to my libertarian friends and talk about like things like self-preservation, like in order for libertarianism to work, I think that most of the time reduces for like, in order for that society to work, all beings in that society have to be like hyperlogical actors, right? Like you won't ever do anything that will fall outside. Like in order for someone to be greedy or do something that hurts their neighbor in a libertarian sense without the arm of the state, right? They would have to have an understanding that with their place in society and their community, the people that interact with them would not interact with them in the way that is necessary for him to thrive. So if he, cheats a deal in this like the stateless libertarian type of way, the punishment is that he is no longer accepted in his community and nobody like will deal with him, mm-hmm. right? That's a really oversimplified explanations of how libertarians have talked to me in the past, like how people can self-govern without a nanny state forcing everyone to do what they're supposed to do, mm-hmm. right? I think that there are many types of situations in which that could easily be, because all those people will have to do it would only take a certain amount of people in order to disrupt the order and to start like creating a hierarchy based around a group.
Yes.
They all they have to do is be the biggest game in town and the most organized game of town, and that system disappears, right? When it comes to systems and how they fix things, like I don't know, but I definitely don't know how to fix people. Like I know that if you feel like you have racial hiring practices, I know that a way to get around that is to assign a person. I mean, everything else is the same, except you take their picture away. If it's like just an application, you take their picture away and you take their name off of their application. I know this because that experiment's been done, right? If a change in practices change outcomes, and that has nothing to do with like if the person that's doing that, who's looking at those papers, is a racist or a good person or whatever, right? A change in that system changed the outcome.
How do systems get changed? And that is a loaded question, because I'm assuming something with it, and I'm suggesting that systems are changed by individuals who understand the problem.
Sure, but like we're not talking about whether or not individuals exist. This is why I wanted to make the distinction in the beginning of individuals versus individualism. Right? So I don't want to do that thing where we are saying that we're at one moment we're talking about individualism, like when people talk about systems, they don't think individuals exist.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, I think that is just whatever. Maybe it's a throwaway comment, but yeah, I mean, I think the practical nature of that is simply that you're right. You're not saying that individuals don't exist, but I guess my statement is just that systems are just a fake idea in the mind of individuals, and if you took those individuals out and put them in place with other people, you'd have the same system, but you'd have the same problems with different individuals and all these individual problems. The point being, I believe that the best way to have good systems is through individualism, is through like the interest in one's character.
Do you think do you think
character matters?
Of course.
Okay.
But I want to minimize the amount at which character can negatively affect other people's lives.
But what about positively? That's the piece that we also we get close to, and it's interesting. I don't think you're like uber cynical, and I'm not uber optimistic either, but I've noticed that like I'm trying to, I guess, like acknowledge the possibility of the good outcomes, like good rich people and good character.
But I think that it's all I think this is all word games. I think that
semantics, I guess, matter, don't you think?
Well, no, because it's like I say I want to minimize the amount of harm that a negative character in a person can do, right? Which means that I am actually trying to do a positive. The fact that I want things to run the way that they're supposed to run, I know there's an assumption in there, just leave it alone for a minute, is a good thing. Like, for the sake of this argument, like, you know, more people being off the street, more children being adopted into good homes, like, or less children starving or whatever. Those things need to happen. The more that happens, the better. If we go into those things and discover waste, discover fraud, discover whatever, what we need to do is not just take the people that are guilty of those things out, but we need to see if we can design it in a way that either eliminates or lessens the probability of that happening.
Yeah.
And hopefully maybe, you know, punish the people involved to disincentivize like that action in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I get that. It makes sense. I think, I think the reason for the word games, the reason for the seesawing is like this, every action, there's a reaction kind of idea. There's like this sort of the same criticism that's been leveled against like the Patriot Act or some shit like that. It's like every time you trade a freedom, you might be getting a sense of security, but you're giving away something too. And I think the reason that I'm offering what I'm offering is something like, yes, when you try to minimize the bad, you're also minimizing a potential good. When you try to minimize the good, you're minimizing a bad, like this balance.
And this is where I am I have been woefully uneducated this whole conversation, but this is where it's going to show a lot more.
You don't sound uneducated. I'll tell you that much.
What material harms, not idealistic ones, has the Patriot Act caused?
Oh, Jesus. What did you say? Material?
Yeah, what like things that we can blame on the Patriot Act that are not idealistic but material.
I think I don't remember if this has to do with the Patriot Act or not. Was it?
And I'm not trying to excuse the material, like the Patriot Act. I think that also is like an infringement on like the privacy of Americans. But people bring it up all the time.
Well, the Snowden thing, was that related to the Patriot Act?
I don't know. I know that there has been a tightening of whistleblowers and like that's been blowing the whistle has become harder and harder as the years have gone on. No matter whether or not you're in a government agency or whatever, you can't just be a whistleblower or just deemed as virtuous without the powers that be coming after you. But I don't know if that has anything to do with the Patriot. No, wait a minute. It does have to do with the Patriot Act because it had to do with the creation of the information systems, right? But I'm not sure if the Patriot Act itself, if they just went after that dude for like espionage and treason.
For Snowden? Yeah, which was horseshit. But if Snowden is related to the Patriot Act in the way that I suspect, like a material outcome of that was like the government's ability to spy on privately shared social media shit or whatever. That was a thing. Or maybe buying that information. I'm not sure.
So, because I see corporatism, I don't see a difference between companies doing it and the government doing it. I think that's six in one hand, honestly. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Because again, I hear about it a lot, and I hear in an idealistic sense, that's bad because this is something that we need to, like, privacy is something we need to protect as being sovereign American citizens, but never an outcome.
Yeah, and that's fair. And I if I'm going to bring it up, I probably should have some better sense of it, and I probably shouldn't use it as an example because I don't have one. Maybe more practically, it's just like, one thing that came to mind when I was talking about was like, I remember when the seatbelt law became a thing. Mm-hmm. And of course, like, I understand why it exists, but libertarians are kind of the mind that, like, you should live in a society where you can take drugs if you want to. You can risk your life if you want to. And if you want to drive without a seatbelt, that is your right as a person. And I used to hang with libertarians, and I was like, yeah, I mean, I totally get that. I totally see what's useful about that. But can I imagine it being exchanged for fewer deaths? I don't know, kind of.
And not even just fewer deaths, right? People, like, misunderstand. So this is where community and networks, because people talk about systems. People and systems is now kind of the politically social charged buzzword of, like, trying to understand the mind of a leftist. But what we mean is community. What we mean is network. What we mean is isn't it interesting that, like, if you have a group of 5 friends and 4 of them are smokers, the likelihood of you being a smoker, the probability of you being a smoker, or if this happens with obesity, people trace that. Like, if 4 or 5 of your friends are obese, then the probability of you being obese is like higher. And so if we look at ourselves and how we are through the lens of our relationships, we end up having less agency than we think we do. And that's a little interesting.
It is interesting. I mean,
I started working out a lot because the people around me started hitting the gym, and it only takes a little bit of time and the dominoes to start to fall. Like I told myself years ago I'd never grow a beard.
oh yeah,
You know,
I like the beard.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But my wife can probably remember, like probably earlier this year, that like I'm anti-facial hair. How do we deal with that? Because that is a truth of human existence.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I hate to say this. I hate to say this. You're right. It is a truth of existence. That is, that is, when I'm faced with that question, it sounds like when you're faced with it, or maybe not, but you could be faced with that question and say, well, from that, I see that like individual autonomy only goes so far. I see the effect that had on me as a Christian and as an anti-theist and a liberal.
Mm-hmm.
And so my thing is to try to withdraw from those influences and not be as influenced by social relationships, and try my best. If that's individualism, if it ain't, I don't care. It's just I try my best to at least know if I'm being manipulated, if I'm being overly influenced by things that I don't want.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that takes form usually ideologically. Like I try not to let other people's beliefs influence mine too much.
Sure.
So that's
No. No.
You said you were tired about an hour ago. Maybe should we call it?
I guess so.
I love talking to you, man. I hope that we keep doing this.
Same.
Yeah.
I'll be back this time next year.
Good. Let's do. I like the yellow too, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
I really like it. Jonathan Greene, thank you.
Thanks for having me.